The story of the Normans in England begins not along the chalky cliffs of Dover, nor in the green valleys of Sussex, but in the windswept fjords and coastal settlements of Scandinavia during the late 8th and early 9th centuries, where seafaring warriors, who would come to be known as Vikings, carved their legacy through a combination of martial prowess, maritime expertise, and an insatiable hunger for land and wealth that would eventually lead their descendants to conquer one of Europe's most prosperous kingdoms. The term Norman itself derives from the Old French Normans or Northmans, meaning men from the north, a designation that reflected the Scandinavian origins of these people, who would transform themselves from pagan raiders into Christian dukes and ultimately into the ruling aristocracy of medieval England. The Viking expeditions that began in the late 792s represented far more than simple piratical raids, constituting instead a complex phenomenon driven by multiple factors, including population pressure in Scandinavian homelands, improvements in shipbuilding technology that made long-distance voyages feasible, political consolidation in Scandinavia that displaced younger sons and ambitious warriors, and the lucrative opportunities presented by wealthy but poorly defended monasteries and towns along the coasts of Britain, Ireland, and Francia. The raiders who descended upon the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793, killing monks and plundering sacred treasures, inaugurated a period of sustained Scandinavian activity that would reshape the political geography of northwestern Europe over the following 2.5 centuries. These early Viking raids followed seasonal patterns, with warriors arriving in spring aboard their distinctive longships, conducting rapid strikes against coastal and riverine targets, and returning home before winter storms made navigation too hazardous. But by the mid-9th century, this pattern began to shift as Viking forces established permanent winter camps that allowed for year-round operations and eventual settlement. The establishment of the Danelaw in eastern England during the 872nd and 882nd demonstrated the transition from raiding to settlement, with large Viking armies conquering substantial territories and establishing Scandinavian-ruled kingdoms at York, in East Anglia, and across the 5 boroughs of the East Midlands, creating a demographic and cultural legacy that would persist for centuries through place names, legal traditions, and genetic inheritance. The particular group of Scandinavians, who would give their name to Normandy, arrived in the Seine Valley during the early decades of the 10th century, part of a broader pattern of Viking activity that had devastated large portions of northern Francia since the 842nd. The lower Seine Valley, with its access to the wealthy interior regions of Francia and its numerous islands that provided defensible bases for Viking forces, had become a favourite target and eventually a permanent settlement zone for Scandinavian warriors who recognized the region's strategic and economic potential. Charles the Simple, King of West Francia, faced mounting pressure not only from Viking raiders, but also from rival Frankish magnates, and the fragmenting political structure that had emerged from the disintegration of Charlemagne's empire, circumstances that made accommodation with powerful Viking leaders an attractive alternative to the costly and largely unsuccessful military campaigns that had characterized earlier Frankish responses to Scandinavian incursions. The treaty concluded at St. Clair-sur-Epte in 911, though its exact terms remain debated by historians due to the absence of contemporary written documentation and the need to rely on later chronicles that may have retrofitted details to suit political agendas, established the foundational arrangement whereby a Viking leader named Rollo received recognition as Count, or perhaps Duke of Rouen, in exchange for defending the Seine approaches against other Viking raiders, converting to Christianity, and acknowledging at least nominal Frankish overlordship. Rollo himself, whose origins remain contested between Norwegian and Danish possibilities, and whose very name appears in sources as both the Scandinavian Hrolfa and the Latinized Rollo, or Gallicized Ru, represented the type of successful Viking war leader who commanded sufficient military force to threaten established powers while possessing the political acumen to recognize when negotiated settlement offered greater long-term advantages than continued raiding. The territory initially granted to Rollo centered on Rouen and the lower Seine Valley, a region that had suffered extensive depopulation during previous Viking raids, and therefore required substantial immigration and reorganization to become economically productive, a process that would involve significant influxes of Scandinavian settlers who brought their language, legal traditions, and social structures into contact and eventual synthesis with the Frankish and Gallo-Roman populations who had survived the tumultuous 9th century. The creation of what would become Normandy represented far more than simple territorial cession, constituting instead a complex process of cultural synthesis that unfolded over several generations as Scandinavian military elite, Frankish administrative traditions, and Christian religious institutions gradually merged to create a distinctive regional identity. Rollo's acceptance of baptism, which occurred either as part of the 911 agreement or shortly thereafter, depending on which chronicle account one credits, symbolized the beginning of religious transformation that would prove crucial to Norman legitimacy within the broader European political and cultural framework, though the sincerity and depth of early Norman Christian commitment remained questionable for several decades. As archaeological evidence suggests, continued use of pagan burial practices and runic inscriptions well into the mid-10th century. The linguistic transformation of the Norman population occurred with remarkable rapidity, as the Scandinavian language spoken by Rollo's followers gave way within 2 or 3 generations to the regional dialect of Old French spoken in northern Francia, though this linguistic assimilation left significant traces in Norman French vocabulary, particularly in maritime, legal, and administrative terminology that reflected the Scandinavian heritage of the Norman elite. The adoption of Frankish feudal structures and political concepts likewise proceeded quickly, with Norman rulers distributing land to their followers according to principles that combined Scandinavian traditions of military followership with Frankish notions of vassalage, creating a tightly organized and hierarchical political structure that would later prove highly effective in enabling rapid military mobilization and coordinated political action. The architectural development of early Normandy reflected this cultural synthesis through the construction of fortifications that combined Scandinavian earthwork techniques with Frankish stone-building traditions, creating defensive structures that would evolve into the motte and bailey castles that Norman forces would later construct throughout England, while church-building programs sponsored by Norman rulers demonstrated their commitment to Christian identity and provided physical evidence of their integration into European Christian civilization. The expansion of Norman territory beyond the original Seine Valley concession occurred through a combination of negotiated grants from Frankish kings and military conquest, with significant territorial additions in 924 and 933, extending Norman control westward to include the Cotentin Peninsula and the Avranchin, thereby incorporating lands with substantial Breton populations and establishing the territorial extent that the Duchy of Normandy would maintain throughout the medieval period. The consolidation of ducal authority within Normandy during the 10th and early 11th centuries involved overcoming significant internal challenges from rival magnates, establishing effective administrative and judicial systems, and developing the ideological and institutional foundations that would enable the Norman dukes to exercise unusually strong central authority compared to their counterparts in other French principalities. William Longsword, Rollo's son who ruled from approximately 927 to 942, faced the dual challenge of maintaining Norman identity and cohesion while integrating more fully into Frankish political culture, a balancing act that created tensions evident in contemporary sources, describing his efforts to learn and use the Danish language of his followers, while also participating fully in Frankish aristocratic culture and religious patronage. The assassination of William Longsword by Arnulf of Flanders in 942 precipitated a succession crisis that nearly destroyed Norman political unity, as the new Duke Richard I was still a child and faced challenges from both external enemies, seeking to exploit Norman weakness and internal factions questioning the hereditary principle of succession that had been established with William. Longsword's accession. Richard I, who would earn the sobriquet Fearless through his successful navigation of these challenges, and his long reign from 942 to 996, established key precedents for ducal authority through his cultivation of loyal aristocratic families, whom he bound to ducal service through land grants and marriage alliances, his development of an effective comital administration that extended ducal power throughout Norman territory, and his patronage of monastic reform that created institutional supports for ducal authority, while demonstrating Norman commitment to contemporary religious movements. The monastic reform movement that spread through Normandy during the late 10th and early 11th centuries, inspired by the Cluniac reforms originating in Burgundy and supported enthusiastically by Norman dukes, beginning with Richard I, transformed the Norman church through the foundation of new monasteries, the reform of existing religious houses, and the introduction of Benedictine discipline that created centers of learning, artistic production, and spiritual authority that would play crucial roles in Norman culture and political legitimacy. The reign of Richard II from 996 to 1026 witnessed the continued maturation of Norman political institutions and the emergence of Normandy as a significant regional power whose dukes could negotiate as equals with the kings of France and England, while the duchy's growing prosperity based on agriculture, trade, and efficient exploitation of natural resources provided the economic foundation for military strength and cultural achievement. The marriage of Richard II's sister Emma to King Ethelred II of England in 1002 established the first formal connection between the Norman ducal house and the English throne, a relationship that would prove crucial to later Norman claims to the English succession, and that reflected the contemporary perception of Normandy as a power of sufficient importance to merit alliance with the English kingdom. The crisis of Ethelred's reign, characterized by intensifying Danish attacks and the eventual conquest of England by Sweyn Forkbeard and his son Knut, brought Emma and her children by Ethelred to Normandy as refugees, creating a situation wherein potential English kings lived under Norman protection and absorbed Norman cultural and political influences during their formative years. The Norman ducal court during the early 11th century attracted warriors, scholars, and churchmen from across northwestern Europe, creating a cosmopolitan environment that facilitated cultural exchange and the development of sophisticated administrative and military techniques. While the duchy's strategic position between the French royal domain, the Flemish counties, the Breton duchy, and England across the Channel provided Norman dukes with diplomatic flexibility and multiple options for alliance formation. The reign of Duke Robert I, from 1027 to 1035, though relatively brief and marked by controversy regarding Robert's relationship with Herlever of Falaise and the uncertain legitimacy of their son William, nevertheless demonstrated continued Norman political vitality through successful military campaigns, including intervention in Flanders and support for the restoration of Edward the Confessor to a position of influence in England through diplomatic pressure on King Knut. Robert's death during a pilgrimage to Jerusalem in 1035 created another succession crisis, as William was approximately 7 or 8 years old and faced challenges to his authority from rival Norman magnates, who questioned whether an illegitimate child should inherit the duchy. But the young duke's survival through this dangerous minority period, achieved through the protection of loyal guardians and the support of King Henry I of France, who recognized the advantage of having a weak and dependent duke in Normandy, would prove crucial to his later achievements. The minority and early reign of William of Normandy, who would later gain fame as William the Conqueror and William the Bastard, represented a period of severe testing for Norman political institutions, as the duchy descended into near anarchy, with rival aristocratic factions struggling for control, assassinations, eliminating several of William's guardians and supporters, and external enemies seeking to exploit Norman weakness. The violent deaths of William's guardians, including his uncle Count Gilbert of Brionne, who was assassinated around 1040, his tutor Turold, who was killed in approximately 1040 or 1041, and the steward Osborne, who was murdered in William's own bedchamber around 1040, demonstrated the dangers that surrounded the young duke and the weakness of ducal authority during his minority, when powerful nobles pursued their own interests without regard for the stability of the duchy or the safety of their nominal overlord. The Battle of Valles Dunes in 1047, where William, with the military support of King Henry I of France, defeated a coalition of rebel Norman barons, marked the turning point in the young duke's struggle for control of his duchy and demonstrated his military capability and political determination. Despite his youth and the stigma of illegitimacy that his enemies had exploited to challenge his authority, the consolidation of William's authority during the late 1042 and 1052 involved not only the military defeat of internal opposition, but also the systematic development of administrative institutions, the construction of a network of castles that extended ducal power throughout Norman territory, and the cultivation of ecclesiastical support through patronage of monastic reform and participation in the broader movement for church reform that was transforming European Christianity. The Council of Reims in 1049, where William appeared alongside other princes to support Pope Leo IX's reform program, demonstrated the Duke's integration into European political and ecclesiastical affairs, while earning papal goodwill that would later prove valuable when William sought ecclesiastical approval for his invasion of England. The marriage of William to Matilda of Flanders, around 1050 or 1051, though initially opposed by the papacy on grounds of consanguinity that required several years of negotiation and penance before receiving formal sanction, created a crucial alliance with Flanders that brought substantial political and economic advantages while producing numerous children, whose marriages would extend Norman influence throughout northern France and England. William's military campaigns during the 1052 against neighbouring princes, including successful expeditions against Geoffrey Martel of Anjou and punitive raids into Brittany and the French royal domain, established his reputation as a formidable military leader whose tactical skill and organisational capability marked him as one of the most dangerous princes in northern France. The evolution of Norman military techniques under William's leadership reflected both the Duke's personal experience in warfare and the broader development of cavalry tactics, castle construction methods, and combined arms coordination that would prove decisive in the conquest of England, while the administrative efficiency that William achieved in Normandy through the exploitation of ducal rights, the expansion of the Duke's demesne lands, and the development of effective financial and judicial institutions provided the organisational foundation that would enable the logistical achievement of mounting a cross-channel invasion. The political situation in England during the 1042 and 1052 created the circumstances that would eventually lead to Norman intervention and conquest, as King Edward the Confessor's childless reign raised increasingly urgent questions about succession arrangements, while the complex factional politics of the English court pitted Norman influences, represented by Edward's long exile in Normandy against the power of native English aristocratic families, particularly the House of Godwin that had risen to dominate English politics during the reign of King Canute. Edward's accession to the English throne in 1042, following the deaths of Canute's sons, who had ruled England since 1035, represented a restoration of the old West Saxon royal house, but occurred under circumstances that required Edward to accommodate himself to existing power structures established during the Danish conquest, particularly the enormous power of Earl Godwin of Wessex, who controlled the wealthiest and most strategically important earldom in England, and whose political influence extended throughout the kingdom. The growing presence of Norman and other continental advisors at Edward's court during the 1042 reflected the king's cultural formation during his long exile and his natural inclination toward figures who shared his experiences and perspectives. But this continental influence generated increasing tension with the English aristocracy, who resented foreign interference in English affairs and saw their own political influence threatened by Edward's promotion of outsiders. The crisis of 1051, when this tension erupted into open conflict between King Edward and Earl Godwin over the appointment of a Norman to the Archbishopric of Canterbury, and other grievances related to continental influence at court, resulted in the temporary exile of Godwin and his family, creating a brief period when Norman influence at the English court reached its zenith, and when, according to later Norman sources, Edward promised the English succession to Duke William of Normandy. The reliability of Norman claims regarding Edward's promise of the succession remains one of the most debated questions in English historiography, with Norman sources including the Bayeux Tapestry and various chronicles presenting this promise as an established fact, while English sources remain largely silent on the matter, creating uncertainty about whether Edward actually made such a promise, whether any promise was made with full understanding of its implications, and whether Edward possessed the authority to dispose of the English succession through personal commitment, rather than through the established Anglo-Saxon practice requiring election by the witan, the council of leading nobles and ecclesiastics, who traditionally participated in royal succession decisions. The return of the Godwin family to England in 1052, achieved through military pressure and popular support that forced Edward to restore them to their lands and offices, marked the end of the brief period of maximum Norman influence at the English court, and inaugurated the final phase of Edward's reign, during which English aristocratic families reasserted their predominance in political affairs. The death of Earl Godwin in 1053 elevated his son Harold to the position of Earl of Wessex and effective chief minister of the kingdom, making him the most powerful secular figure in England, and the obvious candidate for succession, should Edward die without heirs. Though Harold's power and ambition generated opposition from other English noble families and created political tensions that would influence the succession crisis of 1066. The expansion of Godwin family power during the 1052s and early 1062s through the appointment of Harold's brothers to other major earldoms created what amounted to a family oligarchy that controlled most of England's wealth and military resources, a situation that other nobles, including Mercia's Earl Elfgar and his family, viewed with suspicion and resentment. The complex diplomatic and political maneuvering that characterized Edward's later reign included efforts to balance different factional interests, military campaigns against Welsh princes who threatened the English border, and ongoing questions about succession that Edward apparently left deliberately ambiguous, despite the clear necessity of establishing definite arrangements before his death. The visit of Harold Godwinson to Normandy in 1064 or 1065, the circumstances and purposes of which remain intensely contested, constitutes a crucial episode in the events leading to the Norman conquest, with Norman sources presenting Harold's journey as a mission to confirm Edward's promise of the succession to William, and to swear a personal oath of fealty to the Norman Duke, while alternative interpretations suggest Harold may have travelled to Normandy for entirely different reasons, perhaps to negotiate the release of family members held hostage by William since 1052, and that any oath he swore was extracted under duress or given under false pretenses regarding its content and implications. The circumstances of Harold's oath to William, assuming such an oath occurred, became a central element of Norman propaganda, justifying the conquest, with the Bayeux Tapestry depicting Harold swearing over sacred relics, an action that gave his oath particular solemnity and made its subsequent violation a matter of both political treachery and religious perjury. The political situation in England during the mid-1062s appeared relatively stable under Harold's dominant influence, but this appearance masked significant tensions, including the exile of Harold's brother Tostig from his earldom of Northumbria in 1065, following a northern rebellion against his governance, an event that created a dangerous enemy for Harold and would ultimately contribute to the crisis of 1066 by providing Harold Hardrada of Norway with an English ally, possessing detailed knowledge of English defences and political divisions. The aging King Edward's declining health during 1065 brought succession questions to the forefront of English political concern, with various candidates possessing different claims based on different principles of legitimacy. A situation that virtually guaranteed conflict when the childless king finally died. Edgar the Aetheling, the teenage grandson of King Edmund Ironside and the only surviving male member of the old West Saxon royal house, possessed the strongest hereditary claim according to principles of blood descent, but his youth, inexperience, and lack of independent power base made him an impractical candidate for the throne, in a time when England faced serious external threats. William of Normandy's claim rested on the alleged promise of Edward the Confessor and the oath reportedly sworn by Harold Godwinson, legal foundations that possessed force within continental European political culture, that emphasized sworn obligations and testamentary disposition, but that carried less weight in England, where traditional practice required consent of the Witan for royal succession. Harald Hardrada of Norway based his claim on agreements between his predecessor, Magnus the Good, and King Harthacnut regarding the succession to both kingdoms, a claim that possessed minimal legal merit, but that became significant through Harald Hardrada's military power and his alliance with Tostig Godwinson, who provided both legitimacy and local knowledge for Norwegian intervention in English affairs. The death of Edward, the Confessor, on the 5th of January, 1066, immediately precipitated the succession crisis that contemporary observers had long anticipated, with Harold Godwinson moving swiftly to secure his coronation the following day, an unprecedented speed that reflected both the urgency of the situation and Harold's determination to present his opponents with an accomplished fact before they could organize effective opposition. Harold's election by the Witan and immediate coronation by Archbishop Ealdred of York provided him with the legal and religious legitimacy that English tradition required, but this legitimacy remained contested by external claimants who rejected English succession practices and insisted on their own legal grounds for claiming the throne. The new king faced the daunting task of defending England against multiple invasion threats, while simultaneously consolidating his domestic political position, managing the kingdom's administration and finances, and maintaining the military forces necessary to meet the challenges that were certain to come. William's response to news of Harold's coronation combined genuine outrage at what he perceived as Harold's perjury and usurpation with calculated political maneuvering designed to secure maximum support for his planned invasion, including a diplomatic campaign to win papal approval for his enterprise and to recruit allies and mercenaries from throughout northern France. The papal banner granted by Pope Alexander II transformed William's invasion from a feudal dispute over succession into a holy war to punish an oathbreaker and to reform the English Church according to continental standards, providing religious legitimacy that helped attract supporters and demoralize opposition, while creating legal and moral frameworks that justified the conquest. The military preparations undertaken by William during the spring and summer of 1066 represented an organizational achievement of unprecedented scale, requiring the construction of a large fleet capable of transporting not only thousands of warriors, but also their horses, equipment, and supplies, the accumulation of provisions sufficient for a major campaign of uncertain duration, and the coordination of contributions from Norman vassals and foreign allies into a coherent expeditionary force. The assembly of this invasion armada at the mouth of the Dives River and later at St. Valery-sur-Somme involved logistical challenges that tested Norman administrative capabilities, while demonstrating the resources that William could mobilize through his effective governance of Normandy and his diplomatic success in recruiting non-Norman participants, attracted by promises of English lands and plunder. Harold's defensive strategy during the summer of 1066 focused primarily on the Channel coast, where the Norman threat appeared most immediate and most dangerous, with the English king assembling both his household troops and the general levy of the southern shires to guard the most likely landing sites, while maintaining a fleet to intercept Norman vessels at sea. The seasonal patterns of medieval warfare, which concentrated major operations during the summer and autumn months, when weather permitted extended campaigns, and when agricultural demands did not prevent the mobilization of militia forces, meant that Harold needed to maintain his defensive deployments only until autumn storms would make channel crossing too dangerous for William to attempt. The wind patterns and weather conditions during the late summer of 1066 worked against William's invasion plans by preventing his fleet from sailing north from the Norman coast toward England. A delay that modern meteorologists understand resulted from persistent northerly winds that made sailing toward England impossible with the square-rigged ships of the period, but that contemporary observers attributed to divine intervention, reflecting either God's protection of England or his judgment pending the resolution of the oath-breaking question. The enforced delay of William's invasion created severe logistical strains as the assembled army consumed provisions while waiting for favourable winds. But this delay also produced strategic advantages by forcing Harold to dismiss his southern levies in early September when supplies ran short and agricultural demands required the militia to return home for the harvest, leaving the southern coast temporarily vulnerable at the moment when the Norwegian invasion materialized in the north. Harald Hardrada's invasion fleet, reportedly comprising some 300 ships, carrying perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 warriors, appeared off the Yorkshire coast in early September 1066, sailing up the Humber estuary and advancing toward York in coordination with Tostig Godwinson, who provided local knowledge and promised support from disaffected Northumbrians. The northern English Earls Edwin and Morcar, brothers who controlled Mercia and Northumbria respectively, and who had risen to power following Tostig's expulsion the previous year, attempted to defend York by confronting the Norwegian army at Gate Fulford on September 20, but suffered a severe defeat that eliminated organised northern resistance and opened York to Norwegian occupation. Harold's response to the Norwegian invasion demonstrated both the effectiveness of Anglo-Saxon military organisation and the remarkable mobility that English forces could achieve when circumstances demanded rapid deployment across long distances. The English king covered the approximately 200 miles from London to Yorkshire in roughly 4 days, gathering additional forces during the march while maintaining the element of surprise through the speed of his movement. A logistical and organisational achievement that reflected the sophisticated administrative systems that had developed in late Anglo-Saxon England. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, on the 25th of September, 1066, where Harold's army attacked the Norwegian forces who had dispersed from York to collect hostages and supplies, resulted in a comprehensive English victory that eliminated Harald Hardrada, killed Tostig Godwinson, and shattered the Norwegian invasion force so thoroughly that only 24 ships were required to carry the survivors back to Norway from the 300 that had brought them. The English victory at Stamford Bridge demonstrated that Anglo-Saxon military organisation and the traditional shield wall tactics employed by English infantry remained effective against Viking-style forces, while Harold's personal leadership and the tactical skill of his commanders proved capable of winning decisive battles against formidable opponents. The celebrations following this victory were interrupted within days by news that William's fleet had finally sailed from Normandy and landed at Pevensey on September 28, taking advantage of the wind shift that occurred precisely when Harold was in Yorkshire and exploiting the absence of English forces from the southern coast. William's unopposed landing and the establishment of fortified beachheads at Pevensey and Hastings provided the Norman forces with secure bases, while the deliberate devastation of the surrounding countryside served multiple purposes, including provisioning the army, denying resources to English forces, and provoking Harold into rapid response that might prevent the full mobilization of English military strength. The Norman construction of prefabricated wooden castles, whose components had been brought from Normandy and could be quickly assembled to create fortified positions, demonstrated the sophisticated logistical planning that had characterized William's invasion preparations and provided the Norman army with secure refuges that English forces would find difficult to assault. Harold's decision to march south immediately upon learning of William's landing reflected both the strategic necessity of engaging the Norman army before it could consolidate its position and advance inland, and perhaps also an element of overconfidence following the stunning victory at Stamford Bridge, combined with anger at the devastation being inflicted on Harold's own estates in Sussex. The English king's rapid march south, covering approximately 250 miles in less than 2 weeks, brought him to London by October 6, where he paused briefly to gather additional forces before advancing toward the Norman position at Hastings. The military situation facing Harold as he approached the Norman army presented significant tactical challenges, as William's forces occupied a fortified position near their ships and supply base, making it difficult for English forces to assault them directly, while the continued devastation of Sussex created pressure for Harold to engage the Normans quickly, rather than waiting for full mobilization of English military resources. The composition of Harold's army at Hastings reflected the circumstances of its assembly, with the corps consisting of household troops and Thegians who had fought at Stamford Bridge and marched the length of England twice in 3 weeks, supplemented by levies from the southern shires, who had only recently rejoined the army, and who lacked both the equipment and experience of professional warriors. The exhaustion of Harold's veteran troops, following their extended campaign in Yorkshire, combined with the incomplete mobilization of English military strength due to the rapidity of Harold's march south, created conditions less favorable to English success than might have been achieved through more patient preparation. But Harold's strategic calculation apparently emphasized preventing Norman consolidation and expansion over maximizing English force strength. The advance of Harold's army to a position blocking the road from Hastings to London compelled William to seek battle, rather than allowing the Normans to conduct their intended campaign of systematic conquest, a strategic achievement that demonstrated Harold's sound understanding of his operational situation, despite the tactical disadvantages his army faced. The English force that assembled on the ridge subsequently known as Senlac Hill numbered perhaps 7,000 men, though estimates vary considerably in medieval sources and modern historical analysis, with the household troops and well-equipped fyrds forming the front ranks, while the fyrd levies provided depth and support behind the professional warriors. The weapons carried by English warriors reflected the traditional armament of Anglo-Saxon armies, with heavily armed household troops wielding the fearsome two-handed Danish axes that could cleave through shields and armor, spears that served as both thrusting and throwing weapons, and swords that remained expensive, prestige weapons carried primarily by the aristocracy and their immediate retainers. The defensive equipment employed by English forces included mail hauberks worn by wealthy warriors, leather armor for those who could not afford mail, and the large shields that would interlock to form the shield wall that constituted the foundation of Anglo-Saxon infantry tactics. William's army of approximately 7,000 men, roughly equal in total numbers to the English force, but fundamentally different in composition and capabilities, included perhaps 2,000 cavalry alongside infantry, equipped with spears and swords and archers, armed with both simple bows and the more powerful crossbows that were becoming increasingly common in continental European warfare. The Norman cavalry represented the decisive tactical advantage that William's forces possessed, consisting of heavily armoured knights mounted on specially bred warhorses, and trained in the shock tactics that had proven effective throughout continental Europe, though the utility of cavalry charges against well-formed infantry on favourable terrain remained to be demonstrated. The integration of different troop types into a coordinated tactical system represented a sophisticated approach to warfare that continental European armies had developed during the 11th century, requiring careful coordination between archers who would weaken enemy formations with missile fire, infantry who would engage enemy forces in close combat, and cavalry who would exploit gaps and deliver decisive shock attacks. The Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066 represented a clash between fundamentally different military systems and tactical doctrines, with the English relying on traditional infantry tactics based on the shield wall formation, while the Normans employed combined arms tactics that integrated cavalry, infantry, and archers into a coordinated offensive system designed to break enemy formations through sustained pressure and exploitation of tactical opportunities. Harold's army occupied a strong defensive position on Senlac Hill, approximately 7 miles northwest of Hastings, deploying in the traditional shield wall formation. with heavily armed household troops and Chijians in the front ranks, wielding the fearsome two-handed axes that could cleave through armor and shields, while militia spearmen provided depth and support behind the front line. The English defensive position maximized the advantages of their infantry-based tactics, while minimizing Norman cavalry mobility, as the slope of the hill and the marshy ground on the flanks channeled Norman attacks toward the center of the English line, where the shield wall was strongest. William's army of perhaps 7,000 men included approximately 2,000 cavalry, as well as infantry armed with spears and swords, and archers equipped with both longbows and crossbows, creating a force structure that reflected continental European military developments and that possessed capabilities the English army lacked, particularly in missile weapons and mounted shock combat. The battle commenced around 9 in the morning, with Norman archery attempting to disrupt the English shield wall, but the uphill trajectory required for arrows to reach the English position reduced their effectiveness, while English shields provided substantial protection against missile fire, limiting the impact of this initial phase of the Norman assault. The Norman infantry attacks that followed the archery bombardment likewise failed to break the English defensive formation, as the shield wall held firm against repeated assaults, and English axes took heavy toll of warriors who ventured too close to the English line, demonstrating the continuing effectiveness of traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive tactics when properly employed on favorable terrain. The Norman cavalry charges that constituted the main assault force encountered similar difficulties throughout the morning, as the English position prevented effective mounted charges, while the determination of English resistance and the effectiveness of their weapons made each assault costly in Norman casualties, without achieving breakthrough, creating a tactical stalemate that threatened to end in Norman defeat if William could not find a way to break the English formation. The crisis of the battle occurred around midday, when portions of the Norman left wing, composed primarily of Breton forces, broke and fled down the hill, creating panic that spread through sections of the Norman army and prompting some English warriors to break formation and pursue the fleeing enemy, a breach of discipline that would prove fatal to English hopes. This pursuit, which saw portions of the English right wing abandon their strong defensive position to chase apparently defeated foes, created vulnerability that Norman cavalry exploited by turning on the isolated English pursuers and cutting them down once they were separated from the protection of the shield wall. Whether this initial Norman flight was genuinely panic or a deliberate feigned retreat remains debated among historians, with Norman sources claiming it was a planned tactic, while the confusion and near disaster it caused suggest genuine loss of control. But regardless of its origins, the success of this maneuver in drawing English warriors out of position was subsequently employed deliberately by William, who ordered coordinated cavalry withdrawals that enticed additional English forces to break formation, pursuit, the gradual attrition of English strength through repeated cycles of Norman attack, English counterattack, and the cutting down of isolated groups who had pursued retreating Normans, slowly weakened the English position, despite the continued resistance of the shield wall's core, demonstrating the fatal flaw in Anglo-Saxon tactical doctrine that relied on maintaining rigid formation discipline among troops who lacked the training and experience to resist the temptation of pursuing apparently defeated enemies. William's personal leadership during the most critical phases of the battle proved crucial to maintaining Norman morale and cohesion, particularly when rumours spread during the afternoon that the Duke had been killed, prompting William to remove his helmet and ride among his troops to demonstrate his survival and rally his forces for renewed assault, an act of personal courage that contemporary sources emphasize as decisive in preventing the disintegration of Norman forces at a moment when defeat appeared possible. The battle's intensity continued throughout the afternoon, as Norman forces maintained relentless pressure on the English position through coordinated attacks that combined archery, infantry assaults, and cavalry charges in systematic efforts to break the shield wall or draw additional defenders out of position, while English forces fought with desperate determination, knowing that defeat meant not merely military loss, but the conquest of their kingdom and the destruction of their political independence. The death of Harold Godwinson, late in the day, whether from an arrow wound to the eye as depicted in the Bayeux tapestry, or in close combat with Norman knights as some chronicles suggest, eliminated the central leadership, holding the English army together, and triggered the collapse of organised English resistance, despite the continued fighting of some units who maintained their formation until nightfall. The circumstances of Harold's death remain obscured by conflicting accounts and the partisan nature of sources, with Norman accounts emphasising divine judgment against an oath-breaker, while English sources, when they mention the matter, at all present Harold as dying heroically in defence of his kingdom, but the military and political consequences of his death prove decisive, regardless of the specific manner in which it occurred. The deaths of Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine, earlier in the battle, had already eliminated key subordinate commanders who might have maintained English resistance after Harold's fall, while the casualties among the household troops and the gens who formed the military elite of Anglo-Saxon England created a leadership vacuum that made continued organised resistance impossible. The English defeat at Hastings resulted from multiple converging factors, including the exhaustion of Harold's veteran troops following their extended campaign against the Norwegians, the incomplete mobilisation of English military strength due to the rapidity of Harold's response to William's landing, the tactical disadvantages faced by infantry-only forces confronting combined arms opponents, the critical failures of discipline when portions of the English army abandoned their strong defensive position to pursue apparently fleeing enemies, and the ultimate loss of Harold and his brothers, who provided the command structure necessary for coordinated resistance. The immediate aftermath of Hastings saw the remnants of Harold's army scatter toward London and other English strongholds, while Norman forces began the systematic occupation of southeast England, with William's methodical approach to advancing on London, revealing the strategic sophistication that characterized Norman military operations throughout the conquest period. Rather than marching directly on the English capital following his victory at Hastings, William moved first to secure Dover and its crucial harbour facilities, then swept in a wide arc through Kent and Surrey, devastating the countryside while eliminating potential centres of resistance and demonstrating to English populations the futility of continued opposition to Norman arms. This indirect approach to London served multiple strategic purposes, including the establishment of secure communications with Normandy, through control of the Dover crossing, the denial of resources to potential English resistance forces, through systematic destruction of agricultural stores and livestock, the application of psychological pressure on English leaders who witnessed the destruction being inflicted on the kingdom while lacking the military strength to prevent it, and the demonstration that Norman control would be established through methodical territorial conquest rather than through mere symbolic occupation of the capital. The submission of London occurred through negotiation rather than siege, as the surviving English leaders, including Archbishop Ealdred of York, the young Edgar the Aetheling, whom some nobles had proclaimed as king following Harold's death, and the Earls Edwin and Morcar recognised the impossibility of effective military resistance. Following the destruction of the English army at Hastings and the deaths of King Harold and most of the leading warriors of southern England, the English surrender delegation that met William at Berkhamsted in early December 1066 included the most important secular and ecclesiastical figures remaining in England, and their formal submission represented the recognition that William had effectively conquered the kingdom, even though substantial territories in the north and west had not yet come under direct Norman control. William's coronation as King of England at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066, conducted according to traditional English coronation rituals by Archbishop Ealdred of York, provided the new king with the religious legitimacy that Anglo-Saxon tradition required, while maintaining symbolic continuity with previous English monarchs, despite the revolutionary change in dynasty and the foreign origin of the new ruling elite. The coronation ceremony itself was disrupted by violence when Norman guards outside the abbey, hearing the acclamation of William as king shouted by those inside according to English custom, mistook this for an attack or uprising, and began setting fire to nearby buildings, creating panic that scattered much of the congregation and symbolically foreshadowed the violence and disorder that would characterize the early years of Norman rule. The establishment of Norman control over England during the first months of 1067 involved the systematic replacement of English officials with Norman appointees in key positions, while constructing a network of castles that provided secure bases for Norman garrisons throughout the southern and eastern portions of the kingdom, transforming the English political and military landscape through the introduction of continental European administrative practices and military architecture that had no precedent in Anglo-Saxon England. William's initial policy toward the English population combined elements of conciliation designed to ease the transition to Norman rule with ruthless suppression of any resistance, a dual approach that reflected both practical necessity, given the small number of Norman personnel available to govern a kingdom of perhaps 1.5 million people, and political calculation regarding the most effective means of establishing stable authority over a conquered population. The confiscation of lands belonging to those who had fought against William at Hastings provided the initial pool of estates for distribution to Norman followers, with Harold's extensive personal holdings and those of his family forming the largest concentration of available properties that could reward the warriors and supporters who had participated in the conquest. But William initially attempted to preserve many English landholders in possession of their estates in exchange for their submission and acceptance of Norman overlordship, creating a period of uncertain transition during which the ultimate fate of English landowning remained undecided. The construction of castles, beginning immediately after the conquest, represented perhaps the most visible and enduring symbol of Norman military supremacy, with motte and bailey fortifications rising rapidly throughout England, using techniques perfected in Normandy that allowed swift construction, using local labour and materials, while providing effective defensive positions that could be held by relatively small garrisons against much larger attacking forces. The Tower of London, begun in 1067 on a site at the southeast corner of the old Roman wall, exemplified Norman architectural ambition and military engineering through its massive scale and strategic location, controlling both the city and the Thames approaches, while the White Tower's stone keep that would eventually rise to dominate the London skyline represented a level of military architecture previously unknown in England and demonstrated the permanence of Norman occupation. The proliferation of castles throughout England during the years following the conquest, with contemporary sources suggesting that several hundred fortifications were constructed within the first decade of Norman rule, and archaeological evidence revealing more than 500 castle sites from the Norman period, fundamentally altered the balance of military power by providing Norman forces with secure refuges from which they could dominate surrounding territories, while denying English rebels the fortified positions necessary for sustained resistance against professional Norman forces. William's departure for Normandy in March 1067, leaving England under the governance of his half-brother, Bishop Odo of Bayeux, and his trusted follower, William Fitzosborne, as joint regents, demonstrated both the king's confidence in the stability of his conquest and the pressing need to attend to continental affairs that had been neglected during the invasion and its immediate aftermath, though this absence would soon prove premature, as English resentment toward Norman rule had not been eliminated, but merely suppressed, awaiting opportunity for expression. The rebellions that erupted across England during 1067 and 1068 demonstrated the depth of English resentment toward Norman rule and the willingness of significant portions of the population to resist foreign domination, despite the military disadvantages they faced, while the Norman response to these uprisings revealed the ruthless determination that William would employ to secure his conquest and eliminate any possibility of successful resistance. The uprising in Kent during 1067, led by Eustace of Boulogne, though involving a Norman count who had participated in the conquest rather than English rebels, demonstrated the vulnerability of Norman control when even members of William's own following might challenge his authority, while the failure of this conspiracy and the successful defence of Dover Castle by its Norman garrison illustrated the effectiveness of the castle system in maintaining Norman dominance, even when challenged by substantial military forces. The more serious rebellions that developed during 1068 inches, the West Country, and along the Welsh marches, reflected both English resentment of Norman rule and opportunistic exploitation by Welsh princes, who recognised that Norman preoccupation with internal control offered opportunities for raids and territorial expansion into the borderlands that had traditionally marked the frontier between English and Welsh territories. The northern rebellions that erupted during 1068 and reached their climax in 1069 presented the most dangerous threat to Norman control of England, combining English resistance under the nominal leadership of Edgar the Aetheling with Danish intervention that brought a substantial fleet and army under King Sweyn Estrithson to support English rebels, creating a coalition that temporarily seized control of York and threatened to reverse the Norman conquest by establishing an independent northern kingdom, or returning England to Scandinavian rule, as had occurred under Canute earlier in the century. The sons of the northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, who had initially submitted to William after Hastings, but who grew increasingly dissatisfied with their treatment under Norman rule and the reduction of their traditional power and influence, provided leadership and legitimacy for northern resistance, while their knowledge of local terrain and political networks enabled more effective organization of rebel forces than had occurred in earlier isolated uprisings. The Danish fleet's arrival in the Humber estuary during September 1069, with perhaps 240 ships carrying several thousand warriors, provided English rebels with professional military support and encouraged uprisings. Throughout northern England, where hostility toward Norman rule burned particularly hot, due to the harsh measures that Norman commanders had employed to suppress earlier resistance, and due to the displacement of English lords by Norman appointees who lacked local knowledge and connections. The fall of York to the combined English and Danish forces in September 1069 and the slaughter of the Norman garrison demonstrated the continuing capability of organized English and Scandinavian forces to achieve military success against Norman troops when circumstances favored the attackers, while the destruction of the castle that Normans had built at York symbolized English determination to resist foreign domination and represented a direct challenge to William's authority that could not be ignored without encouraging further rebellion. William's response to the Northern Rebellion of 1069 to 1070 demonstrated the calculated brutality that he would employ when circumstances required exemplary punishment to break the spirit of continued resistance, with the harrying of the North representing systematic devastation on a scale unprecedented in English history, designed not merely to punish rebellion, but to eliminate the economic foundations that might support future resistance, while creating a depopulated buffer zone that would prevent coordination between Scottish forces and English rebels. The campaign that William personally led into Yorkshire during the winter of 1069 to 1070 involved the deliberate destruction of food stores, agricultural implements, livestock, and housing across vast areas extending from the Humber northward to the Tees and westward into the Pennines, creating famine conditions that would persist for years and reduce the population through starvation, disease, and emigration to other regions where survival remained possible. Contemporary chroniclers, including Orderic Vitalis, writing several decades later, but drawing on eyewitness accounts and the collective memory of the devastation, described the horror of the harrying, with estimates that more than 100,000 people perished from starvation and its attendant diseases in the months and years following William's campaign, though modern historians recognize such figures as likely exaggerated, given the total population of northern England, while acknowledging that the demographic and economic impact was catastrophic and that tens of thousands certainly died as direct or indirect result of the systematic destruction. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, 16 years after the harrying, recorded vast areas of Yorkshire and adjacent counties as waste, indicating lands that remained uncultivated and depopulated more than a decade and a half after the devastation, providing documentary evidence for the long-term impact of William's scorched earth tactics that effectively eliminated northern England as a source of resistance for the remainder of his reign. The strategic calculation underlying the harrying reflected William's judgment that securing Norman rule required not simply defeating English military resistance in individual battles or sieges, but breaking the will to resist through punishments so severe that future rebellions would appear futile, a policy of deliberate terror that proved effective in suppressing organized English resistance, but that earned William lasting condemnation from both contemporary chroniclers and later historians, who recognized the campaign as one of the most brutal acts of the entire medieval period. The Danish withdrawal from England following the harrying occurred through negotiated agreement, whereby William paid the Danish forces substantial sums to depart, and King Sweyn abandoned his English allies in exchange for Norman gold, demonstrating William's willingness to employ both military force and diplomatic payments to eliminate threats to his rule, while reflecting the mercenary character of much Danish military activity during this period, when Scandinavian rulers saw English intervention primarily as opportunity for profit, rather than as serious attempt at conquest. The pacification of England during 1070 and 1071 involved not only the suppression of active military resistance, but also the systematic replacement of English landholders with Norman followers, the reform of the English Church, through the appointment of Norman bishops and abbots, and the extension of Norman administrative and legal systems throughout the kingdom, in ways that would fundamentally transform English society and governance. The last significant English resistance centred on the Isle of Ely in the fenlands of East Anglia, where English rebels, under the leadership of Hereward, later celebrated in legend as Hereward the Wake, though contemporary sources provide little reliable information about his actual identity or background, established a fortified position in the marshlands that provided natural defences against Norman military superiority, and that could be supplied by water routes difficult for Norman forces to interdict. The siege of Ely during 1071 required Norman forces to construct causeways across the marshes, using timber, stones, and earth to create paths that would support the weight of armoured cavalry and siege equipment, while also employing both military pressure and negotiation with the abbey that controlled the island to secure access routes and intelligence about rebel dispositions and capabilities. The fall of Ely and the dispersal of its defenders marked the effective end of organised English military resistance to Norman rule, though isolated. Incidents of violence and banditry would continue for years, as displaced English warriors sought revenge or sustenance through attacks on Norman settlers, and as the bitter resentment of conquest continued to simmer beneath the surface of apparent submission to foreign domination. The submission of Earl Morcar, who had joined the Ely rebels after his brother Edwin's death while attempting to flee to Scotland, completed the elimination of the great English aristocratic families that had dominated pre-conquest England, with Morcar spending the remainder of his life in Norman custody, while his family's vast estates passed to Norman lords, who would use them to establish their own dynasties in England. The consolidation of Norman control over the entire kingdom by 1071 meant that William could turn his attention from military conquest and suppression of rebellion to the establishment of stable governance and the development of administrative systems that would enable effective rule over his new kingdom, though the king would spend much of his remaining reign in Normandy, dealing with threats to his continental territories from the French king and other rivals, rather than residing in England to personally oversee the kingdom's administration. The transformation of English society under Norman rule during the decade following Hastings involved fundamental changes in landholding patterns, aristocratic culture, ecclesiastical organisation, administrative systems, and legal structures that would reshape England into a fundamentally different kingdom from the Anglo-Saxon realm that William had conquered in 1066. The replacement of the English aristocracy with Norman landholders occurred with remarkable thoroughness and rapidity, as evidence from the Domesday Survey demonstrates that by 1086, only 2 major English landholders retained their estates, while Norman, Breton, and Flemish lords controlled virtually all significant holdings throughout the kingdom, representing a social revolution as complete as the military conquest that enabled it and fundamentally altering the character of English aristocratic society. The mechanisms of this aristocratic transformation included outright confiscation of lands belonging to those who had resisted Norman rule. Whether at Hastings or in subsequent rebellions, the gradual pressure on English landholders, who nominally retained their estates, to surrender them to Norman lords through various legal and extra-legal means, including manipulation of inheritance laws and exploitation of debt, obligations, and the death without heirs of English landholders whose families had been destroyed during the conquest, and subsequent rebellions, leaving their estates to escheat to the crown for redistribution. The distribution of confiscated English estates to Norman followers followed patterns that reflected both reward for service during the conquest and strategic considerations regarding the defence of the kingdom and the maintenance of royal authority, with the largest concentrations of lands going to William's most important supporters, who received sprawling honours consisting of manors scattered across multiple counties, rather than compact territorial blocks that might have enabled them to establish regional power bases independent of royal control. This dispersal of baronial holdings throughout the kingdom, rather than concentration in single regions, reflected deliberate royal policy designed to prevent any magnate from establishing a regional power base that might challenge royal authority in the way that the great Anglo-Saxon earls had occasionally defied their kings, demonstrating William's consciousness of the political dangers posed by overly powerful subjects and his determination to structure landholding in ways that maintained royal supremacy while rewarding his followers sufficiently to maintain their loyalty and support. The creation of the great honours that characterised post-conquest English landholding, including William de Warren's holdings centred on his castle at Lowes in Sussex, Roger de Montgomery's extensive estates in the Welsh Marches, and in Sussex, where he held the Rape of Arundel, William de Brieux's lands in the Sussex Rape of Bramber, and the numerous properties granted to William's half-brother Odo of Bayeux in Kent and elsewhere throughout the kingdom, established the framework for English aristocratic society that would persist throughout the medieval period, with these families and their descendants forming the core of the Anglo-Norman nobility. The exceptions to this pattern of dispersed landholding occurred primarily along the vulnerable frontiers of the kingdom, particularly in the Welsh Marches and along the Scottish border, where William granted concentrated territorial holdings to trusted lords, who would be responsible for defending these regions against external threats, while extending Norman control into border territories that had never been fully integrated into the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. The Marcher lordships created along the Welsh border, including those granted to Roger de Montgomery based at Shrewsbury, William Fitzosborne at Hereford before his death in Flanders in 1071, and Hugh de Vranchez at Chester, possessed unusual autonomy and jurisdiction that reflected the military challenges of frontier defence and the need to provide local lords with sufficient authority and resources to respond rapidly to Welsh incursions, without requiring constant reference to royal authority. The introduction of continental European feudal practices into England represented another fundamental transformation that reshaped the relationship between king and landholders, while creating new obligations for military service, financial payments, and political loyalty that differed significantly from the more flexible and less rigorously defined relationships that had characterized Anglo-Saxon landholding. The feudal system that William established in England differed in important respects from the more fragmented feudal structures that characterized much of continental Europe, as the king's determination to maintain strong central authority and his success in conquering an entire kingdom at once, rather than assembling it piecemeal, enabled the creation of a more tightly organized and hierarchical system than existed in France or Germany, where royal authority had been eroded by centuries of noble aggrandizement. The principle that all land was held ultimately from the king in exchange for specified services and obligations meant that even the greatest magnates possessed their estates as tenants-in-chief, rather than as allodial proprietors with absolute ownership, creating legal foundations for royal authority over all landholding throughout the kingdom that would prove crucial in maintaining royal supremacy despite the vast wealth and power of some individual nobles. The Salisbury Oath of 1086, when William required all significant landholders in England regardless of their position within the feudal hierarchy, to swear direct loyalty to him as king, demonstrated the ruler's insistence that royal authority superseded the obligations that vassals owed to their immediate lords, preventing the development of private feudal networks that might challenge royal power and establishing the principle that ultimate allegiance belonged to the crown rather than to intermediate lords in the feudal chain. The military obligations that accompanied feudal landholding required tenants-in-chief to provide specified numbers of knights for royal service, with these quotas determined not by any consistent assessment of land value or productivity, but rather by negotiation and custom that reflected the circumstances of individual grants, the importance of particular followers to William's success, and the strategic significance of the territories they held. The total military obligation owed by all tenants-in-chief amounted to approximately 5,000 knights, according to most scholarly estimates, based on analysis of surviving records, creating a substantial military force that the king could summon for campaigns in England, Normandy, or elsewhere, while distributing the costs of maintaining this force across the landholding class, rather than requiring the crown to support a large permanent army from royal revenues alone. The practical implementation of these knight service obligations required tenants-in-chief to grant portions of their estates to military followers who would serve as knights in fulfillment of their lord's obligation to the king, creating a process of subinfeudation that extended the feudal hierarchy downward through multiple levels, while complicating the relationships between lords and vassals, and creating networks of obligation that sometimes produced conflicting loyalties when different levels of the feudal hierarchy pursued divergent interests. The development of these subinfeudated estates proceeded rapidly during the decade following the conquest, as major landholders, who had received extensive properties from William, needed to secure their control over scattered manors while fulfilling their military obligations, leading them to grant lands to military followers who would serve both as knights for royal campaigns and as local enforcers of their lord's authority over English peasant populations who might otherwise resist Norman control. The ecclesiastical transformation of England under Norman rule paralleled the secular conquest through the systematic replacement of English bishops and abbots with Norman clergy, the reform of English religious practices according to continental standards, and the integration of the English Church into the broader European reform movement that was transforming Latin Christianity under papal leadership. Lanfranc's appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1070, filling the vacancy created by the deposition of Archbishop Stigand, on grounds of his irregular canonical position, and his possession of the See of Winchester, in plurality with Canterbury, brought to the primacy of the English Church, one of the most distinguished scholars and administrators in Latin Christendom, whose reforming zeal and organizational skills would reshape English ecclesiastical institutions according to the ideals of the Gregorian reform movement. Lanfranc's program of reform addressed multiple aspects of English church life, including the enforcement of clerical celibacy, which had been imperfectly observed in pre-conquest England, where many priests maintained wives or concubines. Despite theoretical prohibitions, the reorganization of diocesan boundaries to move cathedral churches from small rural settlements to major urban centers, where bishops could exercise more effective oversight and where cathedral chapters could draw on larger populations and greater economic resources, and the introduction of continental European canonical learning and administrative procedures that aligned English practices with those of Reformed churches elsewhere in Europe. The replacement of English bishops and abbots with Norman clergy proceeded systematically during the 1072 and early 1082, with William and Lanfranc cooperating to ensure that ecclesiastical leadership passed to men who shared their reform agenda and who possessed the administrative skills necessary to manage major religious institutions while supporting royal authority and Norman political control. The Council of Winchester in 1076 exemplified the reform programme's scope and ambition through its promulgation of decrees addressing clerical behaviour, diocesan organisation, liturgical practices, and the relationship between secular and ecclesiastical jurisdiction, while asserting royal and archiepiscopal authority over the English Church in ways that would establish precedents for centuries of church-state interaction. The construction of new cathedral churches throughout England in the Norman Romanesque style represented the physical manifestation of ecclesiastical reform and Norman cultural dominance, with massive stone structures rising in Winchester, Canterbury, Durham, Lincoln, and other episcopal centres to replace the Anglo-Saxon buildings that Norman reformers considered inadequate, both architecturally and symbolically, for the dignity of Reformed Christianity. The development of Norman ecclesiastical architecture in England created some of the most impressive monuments of medieval European civilization, while demonstrating the resources that could be mobilized for religious construction and the sophisticated engineering capabilities that Norman builders possessed, combining massive scale with innovative structural techniques to create buildings that served simultaneously as houses of worship, symbols of Norman power, and demonstrations of the cultural superiority that the conquerors claimed over the conquered English population. Durham Cathedral, begun in 1093 on a dramatic site overlooking the River Wear in the heart of the turbulent north, where the prince-bishops exercised both spiritual and temporal authority, exemplified the ambition and achievement of Norman ecclesiastical building through its massive scale that included a nave extending more than 200 feet in length, its innovative structural techniques, including the earliest large-scale use of pointed arches and ribbed vaulting in English building, that would later influence the development of Gothic architecture, and its strategic location that made the cathedral serve as fortress as well as church in a region where Norman control remained contested for decades after the conquest. The architectural innovations employed at Durham, including the systematic use of ribbed vaults that distributed structural loads more efficiently than earlier barrel vaulting techniques and allowed for larger window openings that admitted more light into the interior, demonstrated the experimental character of Norman architecture and the willingness of builders to push structural techniques toward new achievements, while creating buildings that would influence architectural development throughout medieval Europe. The sculptural decoration employed at Durham and other Norman churches featured geometric patterns, including the distinctive chevron or zigzag mouldings that became characteristic of Norman Romanesque ornament, stylized foliage capitals that drew on classical precedents while adapting them to medieval aesthetic sensibilities, and figural sculpture that adorned doorways and capitals with representations of biblical scenes, saints, and sometimes fantastic creatures drawn from bestiary traditions. The construction process required for these massive cathedrals involved the mobilization of extensive resources, including skilled masons, brought from Normandy and recruited from other parts of Europe, where stone-building traditions were more developed than in Anglo-Saxon England. Vast quantities of stone quarried from sites that might be many miles from the building location and transported by road or river at enormous expense, a timber for scaffolding, and roof structures that required the felling of entire forests, and the labour of hundreds of workers over decades of continuous effort that might span multiple episcopal reigns. Winchester Cathedral's reconstruction under Bishop Walkerlin, begun in 1079 and continuing for decades thereafter, created what would become the longest medieval cathedral in Europe, with its nave eventually extending more than 550 feet from west front to retrochoir, demonstrating the ambition of Norman ecclesiastical patrons while providing a building that could accommodate the elaborate liturgical ceremonies that characterized Reformed monastic practice and that could house the Shrine of Street, Swithun, whose cult made Winchester a major pilgrimage destination. The patronage of monastic foundations by Norman magnates, including the establishment of new houses following the Cluniac or other Reformed Benedictine observances, and the endowment of existing monasteries with extensive lands and privileges, created a network of religious institutions that served multiple functions, including providing spiritual services through prayer and celebration of the liturgy, maintaining schools for educating clergy and aristocratic youth in Latin learning and ecclesiastical discipline, managing agricultural estates that demonstrated advanced farming techniques, and preserving learning through libraries and scriptoria, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. The administrative transformation of England under Norman rule built upon the sophisticated governmental structures that had developed during the late Anglo-Saxon period, while introducing continental practices and strengthening central authority in ways that would shape English government for centuries, creating institutional frameworks and procedural precedents that would evolve into the distinctive characteristics of English royal administration. The Domesday Survey, commissioned by William in 1085 and completed in 1086, represented the most comprehensive governmental assessment undertaken in medieval Europe, recording detailed information about landholding, population, resources, and obligations throughout England, with a thoroughness that had no parallel in contemporary kingdoms, and that would not be matched until the development of early modern census-taking and cadastral surveys. The survey's purpose encompassed multiple royal objectives, including establishing a definitive record of who held what lands and under what terms, following the upheavals of the conquest period, when estates had changed hands through confiscation, grant, and usurpation in ways that created confusion and competing claims. Assessing the kingdom's resources for taxation purposes to enable more efficient collection of royal revenues, determining the military obligations owed by different landholders to ensure that the king could summon the full feudal host when necessary, and asserting royal authority through the demonstration of the king's capacity to obtain detailed information about every manor and every landholder throughout the realm. The methodology employed in conducting the survey revealed sophisticated administrative capabilities that drew upon Anglo-Saxon traditions of record-keeping and local administrative organization, while implementing continental European approaches to territorial assessment and fiscal management, with royal commissioners travelling throughout the kingdom, gathering information from local juries composed of the priest, reeve, and 6 villagers from each vill who testified under oath about the identity of landholders, the extent of their holdings measured in hides or carucates depending on regional custom, the value of estates both in King Edward's time and at the present, the number of ploughs in use, the population divided into various categories, including free men, villeins, bordars, cotters, and slaves, and the presence of resources including mills, fisheries, woodland, and pasture. The massive compilation of data collected by these commissioners through their circuits during 1086 was organized and recorded in Domesday Book, actually consisting of 2 volumes, with the larger Great Domesday covering most of England in a somewhat abbreviated format, while the more detailed Little Domesday recorded information for Essex, Norfolk, and Suffolk with greater specificity regarding population, resources, and values, creating a documentary resource that provided unprecedented information about English society and economy, while serving as a legal record for resolving disputes about landholding that would be cited in courts for centuries. The nickname Domesday, meaning Judgment Day and reflecting the survey's perceived finality, emerged within a generation of the survey's completion and reflected contemporary recognition that the verdicts recorded in the survey about landholding were final and unchallengeable, much as God's judgment at the end of time would be absolute, while also suggesting the anxiety and resentment that some English landholders felt about this comprehensive royal investigation into their affairs that exposed their diminished status under Norman rule. The legal innovations introduced under Norman rule combined elements of continental European practice with existing Anglo-Saxon law to create distinctive English legal traditions that would eventually develop into the common law system, though this development occurred gradually over generations rather than through any single comprehensive reform undertaken by William or his immediate successors. William's policy toward English law involved the preservation of Anglo-Saxon legal codes and procedures in areas not directly affecting royal power or Norman interests, allowing most disputes between English subjects to be resolved according to traditional customs and laws that had developed over centuries of Anglo-Saxon governance, while introducing Norman legal concepts regarding feudal obligations. the rights and privileges of the aristocracy, and offences against the king's peace that expanded royal jurisdiction at the expense of local and private courts. The forest law that William imposed throughout England represented one of the most resented innovations of Norman rule, creating vast royal forests where special laws protected game animals and restricted the rights of inhabitants to hunt, clear land for agriculture, gather firewood, or allow their livestock to graze, with severe penalties including death, mutilation, or heavy fines for violations of these restrictions. The extent of land designated as royal forest reached levels that infuriated the English population, with perhaps 1/3 of the kingdom falling under forest law jurisdiction at the system's maximum extent under William's sons, creating a regime that generated substantial revenue through fines and fees while providing hunting preserves for the king and his favoured companions, and demonstrating royal power through restriction of traditional rights that English populations had previously exercised freely. The development of royal courts operating alongside traditional local courts created a dual legal system that would eventually evolve towards centralised royal justice, as the king's courts gradually expanded their jurisdiction, attracted litigants through procedures that, whatever their other characteristics, proved more efficient and less subject to local corruption than the courts of hundred and shire that had administered justice in Anglo-Saxon England. The appointment of royal justices who would eventually travel on circuit through the counties to hear cases and supervise local administration represented an innovation that built upon Anglo-Saxon precedents, including the use of royal officials to investigate and punish major crimes, while introducing more systematic royal oversight of local justice and creating mechanisms that would later develop into the system of itinerant justices that became central to English common law. The economic impact of the Norman conquest and the policies implemented under Norman rule produced both disruption and development, with the short-term devastation caused by military operations, rebellions, and punitive campaigns like the harrying of the North, eventually giving way to recovery and growth, based on more efficient exploitation of resources, expanded trade connections, and the introduction of new agricultural and manufacturing techniques from the continent. The immediate economic impact of the conquest included extensive destruction of property and resources through military campaigns that swept across the southern and eastern counties during 1066 and 1067, the disruption of trade and agricultural production during years of warfare and instability, when merchants avoided English ports and farmers fled their lands to escape violence, and the extraction of wealth from England to Normandy through the transfer of estates to Norman lords, who maintained properties on both sides of the Channel, and who sent English revenues to support their continental holdings and ambitions. The harrying of the North created a demographic and economic catastrophe in Yorkshire and neighbouring counties that required decades for recovery, with Domesday Book recording continuing devastation 16 years after the campaign, while archaeological evidence reveals the abandonment of villages and the contraction of settlement that persisted into the 12th century in the most heavily affected areas where entire landscapes remained depopulated and uncultivated for generations. The geld, the land tax that Anglo-Saxon kings had developed into an efficient revenue-raising mechanism that could extract substantial sums from the kingdom through assessment on hides of land, continued under Norman rule and provided William and his successors with income that supplemented feudal revenues from their demesne lands and from the various feudal incidents, including reliefs, wardships, and marriage rights that kings extracted from their tenants-in-chief. The burden of taxation increased under the Normans as military and administrative costs expanded with the need to maintain garrisons throughout England, to finance campaigns in Normandy and elsewhere on the continent, to support an increasingly elaborate royal household and administration, and to fund the construction projects, including castles and churches, that demonstrated Norman power and permanence. The expansion of trade connections between England and Normandy, facilitated by the political unity of the two territories under a single ruler, and by the cross-channel holdings of many Norman magnates who needed to transport goods, revenues, and personnel between their English and Norman estates, created new commercial opportunities while integrating England more fully into continental European economic networks that connected the ports of the Channel and North Sea with the Mediterranean trade routes. The Norman aristocracy's demand for luxury goods, including fine textiles, spices, wines, and specialized metalwork that were not produced in England, or were produced in insufficient quantities or qualities to satisfy aristocratic tastes, stimulated import trade, while encouraging English merchants to develop commercial relationships with continental suppliers and to expand their own trading activities to generate the revenues necessary to pay for these imports. The construction of castles and churches provided employment for skilled craftsmen, including masons, carpenters, glaziers, and metalworkers, while creating demand for labourers who quarried and transported stone, felled and shaped timber, mixed mortar, and performed the countless tasks necessary for major building projects that might continue for decades. The introduction of new agricultural practices and crops from Normandy, combined with the more systematic exploitation of manorial resources under Norman management, that applied continental techniques of estate administration to English conditions, gradually increased agricultural productivity in many areas. Though these improvements primarily benefited the Norman lords who controlled the land, rather than the English peasantry who worked it under increasingly onerous conditions. The development of demesne farming on many manors, whereby lords retained substantial portions of their estates under direct management, rather than leasing all their land to tenants, required the mobilization of peasant labor through customary obligations that compelled villeins to work specified days each week on the lord's fields. In addition to cultivating their own holdings, creating a system of labor exploitation that generated substantial revenues for lords, while reducing the time and energy that peasants could devote to their own subsistence. The social transformation of England under Norman rule extended beyond the replacement of the aristocracy to encompass changes in language, culture, legal status, and social relationships that created a fundamentally different society from the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had existed before 1066, with the Norman conquest producing effects that permeated every level of English society, from the royal court to the humblest village. The linguistic impact of the Norman conquest created a trilingual society in which Norman French served as the language of the aristocracy, royal government, and high culture. Latin continued as the language of the church, legal documents, and scholarly writing, and English persisted as the language of the common people who comprised the vast majority of the population, but who found themselves increasingly excluded from positions of power and influence. The social barrier between the Norman aristocracy and the English population remained largely impermeable during the first generations after the conquest, with very little intermarriage between Normans and English occurring at the aristocratic level, and with English nobles who survived the conquest and its aftermath, finding themselves relegated to minor positions in local administration, rather than participating in the higher levels of aristocratic society that the Normans monopolized. The gradual emergence of an Anglo-Norman culture during the late 11th and early 12th centuries occurred through processes that included limited intermarriage between Norman men and English women, particularly among the lesser aristocracy and knightly class, where the shortage of Norman women made marriages with wealthy English heiresses attractive. The adoption of some English administrative practices by Norman rulers who recognized their efficiency and effectiveness, and the development of literary and artistic styles that combined Norman and English elements into new synthetic forms. The legal distinction between Normans and English remained important for several generations after the conquest, with the murdrum fine system requiring communities to pay substantial fines to the royal treasury when Normans were killed within their jurisdictions, unless they could prove that the victim was actually English rather than Norman, creating financial incentives for communities to claim English identity for murder victims, while also establishing a legal framework that presumed Norman lives were more valuable than English lives, and that English communities bore collective responsibility for violence against their conquerors. The status of the English peasantry deteriorated significantly under Norman rule, as the more rigorous enforcement of manorial obligations, the introduction of continental feudal concepts regarding servile status, that were more restrictive than Anglo-Saxon traditions had been, and the loss of English landholders who had provided some protection for their tenants left the peasantry exposed to more systematic exploitation by Norman lords who viewed their English tenants primarily as sources of labour and revenue, rather than as members of a community with reciprocal obligations. The reduction of many formerly free English farmers to positions of greater dependence on their Norman lords occurred through various mechanisms, including the imposition of new labour obligations, the restriction of rights to move from one manor to another without the lord's permission, and the expansion of seigneurial jurisdiction over matters that had previously been handled by communal or public courts, creating a more rigid manorial system than had existed in Anglo-Saxon England. The military organisation of Norman England combined traditional Anglo-Saxon systems of military obligation with continental feudal practices to create an effective force for defending the kingdom against external threats, suppressing internal rebellions, and conducting royal campaigns in Normandy and elsewhere on the continent, demonstrating the Normans' ability to adapt existing institutions to their purposes while introducing innovations that enhanced military effectiveness. The feudal host that kings could summon from their tenants-in-chief provided the core of royal military strength, with each major landholder obligated to provide specified numbers of knights equipped with armour, weapons, and horses according to continental standards and trained in cavalry tactics that had proven their effectiveness at Hastings and in subsequent campaigns, creating a force of heavily armoured mounted warriors that could be mobilized for campaigns lasting 40 days, according to traditional feudal custom. The limitations of this feudal military system, particularly the short duration of obligated service that made extended campaigns difficult, and the unwillingness of feudal vassals to serve far from their own territories or in campaigns they considered contrary to their interests, led to the development of alternative arrangements, including scutage payments, whereby landholders could satisfy their military obligations through monetary payments rather than personal service, enabling kings to hire mercenary forces for extended campaigns. The retention of elements of the Anglo-Saxon military system, including the third, or general militia that could be summoned for defence of the kingdom, provided additional manpower that supplemented the feudal cavalry, though the military effectiveness of militia infantry had been demonstrated at Hastings to be inferior to trained cavalry in open battle, leading Norman kings to rely primarily on their feudal knights. While using English levies for garrison duty, siege operations, and defensive warfare, where their limitations proved less critical, the castle garrison system that William and his successors maintained throughout England required permanent military establishments at strategic locations, including the major royal castles at London, Winchester, Colchester, and elsewhere, creating a professional military class of household knights who served for wages and maintenance rather than in fulfillment of temporary feudal obligations, and who provided the king with reliable forces that could be deployed quickly to suppress rebellions or resist invasions. The Norman contribution to English military development extended beyond organisational changes to include tactical innovations that emphasised combined arms coordination, improvements in equipment, including the development of better armour and more effective siege engines, enhanced training that produced more skilled and disciplined warriors, and the introduction of castle warfare that transformed the strategic landscape of the kingdom by creating fortified positions that could control territories with relatively small garrisons. The architectural landscape of Norman England underwent dramatic transformation through the construction of castles, cathedrals, parish churches, and monastic buildings that introduced Romanesque architectural styles to a kingdom where stone construction had been relatively uncommon and where the scale of Norman building projects dwarfed anything attempted in the Anglo-Saxon period. The development of the Motte and Bailey Castle as the standard form of Norman fortification in England during the initial decades after the conquest reflected the need for rapid construction of defensive positions throughout a hostile kingdom, with these fortifications consisting of an artificial mound or motte topped by a wooden tower that provided a final refuge and lookout position, surrounded by a defended enclosure or bailey that contained additional buildings and provided protected space for garrisons, supplies, and sometimes civilian populations seeking refuge during attacks. The construction of these earth and timber castles could be accomplished in weeks or months, using impressed local labour and readily available materials, allowing Norman lords to establish fortified bases throughout their territories with a speed that would have been impossible had they relied solely on stone construction. While the defensive effectiveness of properly constructed motte and bailey castles made them formidable obstacles that could be held by small garrisons against much larger attacking forces lacking siege equipment. The gradual replacement of timber fortifications with stone construction during the late 11th and early 12th centuries reflected both the increasing security of Norman rule that made long-term investment in permanent fortifications worthwhile, and the growing wealth of the Norman aristocracy that enabled them to finance expensive stone construction projects. The development of stone keeps, including the White Tower at London, begun in the 1072. The keep at Colchester, constructed on the foundations of a Roman temple and incorporating Roman materials in its construction, and similar structures at Rochester, Canterbury, and other strategic locations, represented a new type of military architecture that combined defensive strength with residential accommodation for lords and their households, creating buildings that served simultaneously as fortresses, administrative centres, and symbols of Norman power over the conquered landscape. The White Tower's construction under the direction of Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester, and a skilled military engineer who had learned his craft in Normandy and on the continent, produced a structure of unprecedented scale in England, with walls up to 15 feet thick at the base, rising approximately 90 feet to the battlements, and enclosing a complex interior that included a great hall, private chambers, a chapel dedicated to St. John, that demonstrates sophisticated architectural design with its apsidal east end and gallery level, and storage spaces for weapons, provisions, and treasure. The strategic placement of royal castles throughout England created a network of fortified positions that controlled major towns, river crossings, and road junctions, while providing secure bases from which royal forces could deploy to suppress rebellions or resist invasions, demonstrating the systematic approach to territorial control that characterized Norman military planning and that enabled a relatively small number of Norman warriors to dominate a much larger English population. The castle's role extended beyond purely military functions to encompass administrative purposes, including the collection and storage of revenues, the hearing of legal cases in manorial and honorial courts, the maintenance of records documenting the lord's rights and the obligations of his tenants, and the provision of facilities where the complex business of estate management could be conducted securely and efficiently. The construction of cathedrals and major abbey churches represented the other great category of Norman architectural achievement in England, with these ecclesiastical buildings demonstrating even greater scale and ambition than the castles. While employing sophisticated engineering techniques and elaborate decorative programs that showcased Norman artistic capabilities and cultural pretensions, the rebuilding of Canterbury Cathedral, begun by Archbishop Lanfranc shortly after his appointment in 1070, and continuing under his successors, established the architectural program that would be followed at other major ecclesiastical sites, with the destruction of much of the old Anglo-Saxon cathedral and its replacement with a massive, Romanesque structure that employed round arches, thick walls pierced by relatively small windows, and a cruciform plan with projecting transepts and an apsidal east end that reflected continental, European, ecclesiastical architecture. The scale of Canterbury Cathedral, with its nave extending well over 200 feet, and the overall length of the building exceeding 400 feet, when the eastern extensions added in subsequent decades are included, dwarfed the Anglo-Saxon cathedral. It replaced, while providing space for the elaborate liturgies that characterized Reformed Benedictine practice, and for the thousands of pilgrims who would visit Thomas Becket's shrine after the Archbishop's martyrdom in 1170. The architectural techniques employed in Norman ecclesiastical construction demonstrated sophisticated understanding of structural principles, including the use of massive piers and columns to to support the weight of stone vaulting, the development of systems of arcades, galleries, and clerestories that created interior elevations rising to impressive heights, while admitting light through windows placed at multiple levels, and the employment of buttressing systems that channeled lateral thrust from vaults and arches into the earth, through carefully calculated structural members. The decorative vocabulary of Norman Romanesque architecture included distinctive geometric patterns, such as the chevron or zigzag moulding that adorned arches and columns, billet moulding consisting of raised rectangular blocks alternating with spaces, and cable moulding that resembled twisted rope, while figural sculpture appeared on capitals, tympana above doorways, and occasionally on larger programs that depicted biblical narratives or theological themes for the edification of largely illiterate congregations who learned Christian doctrine through visual imagery. The parish church building campaign that accompanied and followed the Norman conquest transformed the religious landscape of England through the construction of thousands of stone churches, replacing earlier timber structures or serving communities that had previously lacked permanent church buildings, with Norman lords founding churches on their manors, both to fulfill religious obligations and to demonstrate their piety and permanence, while also exercising the valuable right of advowson that allowed them to appoint priests to serve at these churches and to collect some of the tithes and other revenues that parishes generated. The characteristic features of Norman parish church architecture included the round-headed arches that appeared in doorways and windows, the thick walls that were necessary to support stone roofs, and that created deeply recessed openings, the simple rectangular or cruciform plans that accommodated the basic liturgical requirements of parochial worship, without the elaboration necessary for monastic or cathedral services, and the occasional defensive features, including towers that could serve as refuges during times of disorder, and that symbolized the church's role as spiritual fortress against evil. The monastic revival that characterized Norman England from the late 11th through the 12th centuries saw the foundation of hundreds of new religious houses, following various rules and observances, transforming the English ecclesiastical landscape while providing institutional supports for Norman rule through the monks' prayers for their patrons and through the monastery's role in economic development, education, and the preservation of learning. The Benedictine houses that multiplied under Norman patronage followed the reformed observance promoted by William and by reform-minded bishops and abbots who sought to impose stricter discipline and more authentic observance of the rule of St. Benedict than had characterized some Anglo-Saxon monasteries, with new foundations including Battle Abbey, established by William on the site of his victory at Hastings, as thanks for divine favour, Selby Abbey in Yorkshire, and numerous other houses that received generous endowments of land and privileges from their Norman founders. The introduction of new monastic orders from the continent during the early 12th century brought alternative forms of religious life to England and attracted patronage from Norman lords, who saw these new foundations as opportunities to demonstrate their piety while potentially achieving greater spiritual benefit through association with reformed and austere communities. The Cistercian order, which arrived in England with the foundation of Waverley Abbey in Surrey in 1128, followed quickly by Reolvolks and Fountains in Yorkshire, appealed to patrons through its emphasis on poverty, manual labour, and withdrawal from secular society, establishing monasteries in remote locations where the monks could pursue their austere observance, while developing previously uncultivated lands through agricultural improvements and innovations, including sheep farming on a massive scale. The Augustinian canons, following a rule attributed to St. Augustine that combined elements of monastic discipline with pastoral responsibilities, established numerous houses during the 12th century and attracted patronage from lords who appreciated that these canons could serve parish churches and perform other pastoral duties while maintaining a communal religious life, providing a form of religious institution that combined monastic ideals with practical service to surrounding communities. The cultural synthesis that gradually emerged during the 12th century, as Norman and English populations began to merge, created a distinctive Anglo-Norman civilization that combined elements from both traditions while developing characteristics unique to the hybrid society that England had become under Norman rule. Though this synthesis occurred slowly and unevenly, with significant regional variations, and with the process accelerating only after several generations had passed since the conquest. The development of Anglo-Norman literature in the 12th century produced works that drew on both Norman French and English literary traditions, while creating new forms and styles that reflected the particular circumstances of Cryer, England's multicultural society, with authors writing in Latin, French, and eventually Middle English, creating chronicles, romances, saints' lives, and other genres that address the interests and concerns of aristocratic and ecclesiastical audiences. Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, completed around 1136 and widely circulated throughout the Middle Ages, exemplified this cultural synthesis through its presentation of legendary British history that provided the Norman rulers of England with connections to an ancient and glorious past that predated the Anglo-Saxon period, thereby legitimizing Norman rule by associating it with the Celtic inhabitants of Britain who had been displaced by the Anglo-Saxon invasions, and who could now be portrayed as the ancestors of the Norman-dominated realm. The Arthurian legends that Geoffrey popularized and that subsequent writers elaborated became central to aristocratic culture throughout England and France, providing models of chivalric behavior and courtly conduct while entertaining audiences with tales of adventure, romance, and magic that offered escape from the mundane realities of medieval life, while also reinforcing the values and assumptions of aristocratic society. The linguistic development of English under Norman rule produced fundamental changes in vocabulary, grammar, and usage that would eventually result in the transformation of Old English into Middle English, though this process occurred gradually over several centuries and reflected complex patterns of borrowing, adaptation, and structural change, rather than simple replacement of English by French. The introduction of thousands of French words into English vocabulary occurred primarily in domains associated with aristocratic life, government, law, the church, and military affairs, where Norman French speakers dominated, and where English speakers needed to adopt French terminology to participate in these institutions, while everyday vocabulary relating to agriculture, family life, and common occupations retained predominantly English origins, reflecting the continued use of English among the general population. The grammatical simplification that characterized the evolution from Old English to Middle English, including the loss of most case endings and the simplification of the gender system that had distinguished masculine, feminine, and neuter nouns in Old English, may have been accelerated by contact with French speakers whose grammatical structures differed fundamentally from English, and who may have influenced English speakers to rely more heavily on word order rather than inflectional endings to indicate grammatical relationships. The survival of English as a living language, despite the political dominance of French speakers and the prestige associated with French culture, demonstrated the resilience of popular culture and the demographic reality that English speakers vastly outnumbered their Norman rulers, ensuring that English would persist even during the period when it lacked literary cultivation and when its use was largely confined to oral communication among the lower social orders. The eventual re-emergence of English as a language of literature and government during the 13th and 14th centuries reflected the gradual integration of Norman and English populations into a unified national community that came to identify as English rather than Norman, though the English language that emerged from this process bore the permanent imprint of Norman French influence in its vocabulary and in certain aspects of its syntax and usage. The relationship between England and Normandy under Norman rule created a cross-channel realm that shaped the political development of both territories while creating complications that would plague successive rulers as they attempted to maintain control over domains separated by the English Channel and subject to different political pressures and competing claims. William the Conqueror's success in maintaining personal control over both England and Normandy until his death in 1087, demonstrated the possibility of governing a cross-channel realm through energetic personal rule, frequent movement between the two territories, the appointment of capable regents to govern during the king's absences, and the ruthless suppression of challenges to royal authority in both domains. The succession arrangements that William made for his territories on his deathbed, designating his eldest son Robert Curthose as heir to Normandy, while bequeathing England to his second surviving son, William Rufus, and leaving only monetary payment to his youngest son Henry, reflected both the king's concerns about Robert's character and capabilities, and his recognition that England and Normandy need not remain permanently united under a single ruler, though this division would create immediate problems, as the brothers competed for supremacy, and as barons holding lands in both territories faced difficult choices about where to place their primary loyalty. William Rufus's reign from 1087 to 1100 demonstrated both the strengths of the governmental system that his father had established and the dangers that could arise when a capable but unpopular king alienated significant portions of the aristocracy and clergy through arbitrary governance, heavy taxation, and conflicts with the church over jurisdiction and revenues, creating resentments that would explode into rebellion when opportunities arose. The rebellions that erupted in 1088, when many Norman barons, who held lands in both England and Normandy, supported Robert Curthose's claim to England, preferring to have both territories united under a single lord rather than serving two different masters whose interests might conflict, demonstrated the political complications created by the division of the Norman realm, though Rufus's suppression of this revolt with the support of English levies and loyal barons proved that the governmental and military systems established by the Conqueror could survive challenges to royal authority. Rufus's conflicts with Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury over investiture, clerical appointments, and the independence of the church from royal control created tensions that would persist throughout the medieval period, and that reflected broader European conflicts between secular and spiritual authorities during the reform movements of the late 11th and early 12th centuries, with Anselm ultimately going into exile rather than submit to what he considered improper royal interference in ecclesiastical affairs. The king's financial exploitation of the church, including his practice of keeping episcopal sees and wealthy abbeys vacant for extended periods, while the crown collected their revenues, his imposition of heavy taxes on ecclesiastical lands, and his interference in monastic elections to ensure the appointment of candidates who would be generous to the crown, generated clerical opposition that found expression in the hostile accounts of his reign, written by monastic chroniclers who portrayed Rufus as an impious tyrant whose sudden death, while hunting in the New Forest in August 1100, represented divine judgment. The circumstances of William Rufus's death, killed by an arrow while hunting in circumstances that remain mysterious, despite extensive speculation by contemporaries and later historians, created opportunities for his younger brother Henry, who was present in the hunting party, and who moved with remarkable speed to secure the royal treasury at Winchester, and to have himself crowned king before Robert Curthose could return from crusade to assert his own claims to England. Henry I's seizure of the throne in 1100 and his rapid coronation before his older brother Robert could return from the First Crusade demonstrated the continuing importance of swift action in succession disputes, while his issuance of a coronation charter that promised to remedy the abuses of his brother's reign and to respect the church's liberties provided legitimacy for what was essentially a usurpation of Robert's rights, while establishing principles regarding royal conduct that would later influence the development of constitutional limits on monarchical power. The consolidation of Henry's position required both diplomatic skill in managing the complex political situation created by his irregular succession and military capability in defending his possession of England against Robert Curthose's invasion attempt in 1101, with Henry's success in negotiating Robert's withdrawal through promises of financial payments and territorial concessions, demonstrating that the king understood when negotiations served his interests better than battle, while his subsequent repudiation of some of these agreements, when circumstances permitted, showed his willingness to employ expedient measures to achieve his objectives. The administrative innovations that characterized Henry I's reign and that earned him recognition as one of medieval England's most effective rulers included the development of the Exchequer as a specialized financial office, employing sophisticated accounting procedures, the expansion of royal justice through increased use of itinerant justices and standardized legal procedures, and the creation of a professional bureaucracy staffed by educated clerks whose careers depended on loyal service to the crown rather than on inherited position or feudal obligation. The Exchequer, which took its name from the checkered cloth used as a counting board for calculating royal revenues and expenditures, represented an institutional innovation that transformed royal financial administration through its systematic procedures for auditing the accounts of sheriffs and other royal officials, its maintenance of records documenting revenues owed to the crown and payments made, and its regular sessions twice yearly that created predictability and accountability in royal finance. The development of the pipe rolls, which recorded the annual accounts of sheriffs and other officials responsible for collecting royal revenues, created a documentary trail that enabled royal officials to track receipts and expenditures across multiple years, to identify patterns of underpayment or corruption, and to maintain institutional memory that transcended individual reigns and that enabled more effective financial management than would have been possible relying solely on the personal knowledge and memory of royal officials. The expansion of royal justice during Henry's reign occurred through the increased use of royal writs that provided litigants with access to the king's courts for resolution of disputes, the dispatch of itinerant justices who travelled on regular circuits to hear cases in the counties and to supervise local administration, and the development of standardized legal procedures that gradually expanded royal jurisdiction at the expense of local and feudal courts, whose procedures were less regular and whose judgments were often influenced by local power, relationships, rather than by consistent application of legal principles. The financial exploitation of feudal rights reached new levels of systematization and thoroughness under Henry's administration, with the king extracting maximum revenues from reliefs paid by heirs succeeding to their ancestors' estates, from wardships that gave the king control over the estates and marriages of underage heirs, whose lands could be administered for royal profit during minorities that might last for years, and from marriage rights that enabled the king to arrange matches for heiresses and widows while collecting substantial payments from those who wished to marry these women, or from the women themselves who sought permission to marry, according to their own preferences, rather than royal dictation. The creation of a class of professional administrators whose careers depended on royal service and who possessed specialized knowledge of law, finance, and administration enabled Henry to maintain effective governance even during his frequent absences from England, when campaigns in Normandy or diplomatic negotiations elsewhere on the continent required his personal attention, demonstrating the evolution toward institutional government that could function effectively regardless of the physical location of the king. The military campaigns that Henry conducted in Normandy to defend his possession of the duchy against his brother Robert, and later against Robert's son, William Clito, required substantial English resources and demonstrated the continuing connection between England and Normandy that made the cross-channel realm both a source of strength through the combination of resources from both territories and a source of vulnerability through the need to defend widely separated domains against multiple threats. Henry's decisive victory over Robert Curthose at the Battle of Tinchebray in Normandy in 1106, which resulted in Robert's capture and imprisonment for the remaining 28 years of his life, reunited England and Normandy under a single ruler for the first time since William the Conqueror's death, and eliminated the most serious dynastic challenge to Henry's authority, though threats from Robert's son William Clito, who was supported at various times by the French king and other continental powers, would continue to trouble Henry throughout his reign. The succession crisis that developed during the later years of Henry's reign, precipitated by the death of his only legitimate son William Adelin in the White Ship disaster of 1120, when a vessel carrying the prince and much of the young Anglo-Norman aristocracy struck a rock in the Channel and sank with almost total loss of life, led to unprecedented arrangements whereby Henry designated his daughter Matilda as his heir and required his barons to swear oaths accepting her succession, despite the lack of precedent for female succession to the English throne, despite the strong preference in medieval political culture for male rulers who could provide military leadership. The oaths sworn by the barons to accept Matilda's succession, first in 1127, and again in subsequent years, as Henry sought to reinforce their commitment, created legal obligations that many would later seek to evade when Henry died, and when the prospect of rule by a woman, particularly one married to Geoffrey of Anjou, whom many Norman barons distrusted and disliked, seemed less attractive than it had when sworn under pressure from a living and powerful king. The death of Henry I in Normandy in December 1135, following what chroniclers reported was overindulgence in lamprey, a delicacy that the king loved despite his physician's warnings about its effects on his aging digestive system, immediately precipitated the succession crisis that contemporaries had anticipated, with Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew through his sister Adela, moving swiftly to cross to England, secure the support of key magnates and ecclesiastics, and have himself crowned before Matilda could assert her claim from her position in Anjou. Stephen's seizure of the throne demonstrated once again the importance of rapid action and physical possession in succession disputes, with his coronation on the 22nd of December 1135, just 3 weeks after Henry's death, presenting Matilda and her supporters with an accomplished fact that would prove difficult to reverse, despite the oaths that had been sworn to accept her as Henry's heir. The support that Stephen received from his brother Henry of Blois, the powerful Bishop of Winchester, who controlled substantial resources and who used his influence with the church to secure ecclesiastical approval for Stephen's coronation, proved crucial in establishing the new king's legitimacy, while Stephen's initial generosity to potential supporters and his willingness to grant away royal rights and properties to secure baronial loyalty helped him consolidate his position during the critical early months of his reign. The civil war that would later be known as the Anarchy began in earnest in 1139, when Matilda landed in England with the support of her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, the most powerful magnate in the kingdom, and a son of Henry I, whose illegitimate birth prevented him from claiming the throne for himself, but whose loyalty to his half-sister's cause provided her faction with crucial military and political leadership. The military campaigns that characterized the anarchy saw neither side achieving decisive advantage, with control over territory shifting repeatedly as barons switched allegiances based on calculations of self-interest rather than principled loyalty to either claimant, creating conditions of sustained disorder that enabled the construction of hundreds of unlicensed castles and the development of private warfare among magnates who exploited royal weakness to pursue their own conflicts and to establish local tyrannies over surrounding populations. The suffering inflicted on the English population during this period of civil war appears vividly in contemporary accounts, particularly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle's famous description of the anarchy as a time when Christ and his saints slept, when men said openly that God and his saints had abandoned England, when torture became commonplace as rival forces extorted resources from helpless populations, and when famine stalked the land as agriculture collapsed under the pressure of constant warfare and systematic pillaging by undisciplined forces serving both sides in the conflict. The fluctuating fortunes of the war included Matilda's capture of Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln in February 1141, which briefly appeared to secure her victory and led to her formal recognition as Lady of the English by a church council at Winchester, but her subsequent expulsion from London by hostile citizens who rejected her arrogant behaviour and her demands for money demonstrated that military success alone could not secure the throne without the political skills necessary to maintain support from crucial constituencies, including the Londoners, whose wealth and strategic position made them essential to any claimant's success. The dramatic reversal of fortune that occurred when Matilda's forces were defeated at the Rout of Winchester in September 1141, and her chief supporter, Robert of Gloucester, was captured. For Robert, through a negotiated prisoner exchange, returning the conflict to stalemate and demonstrating that neither faction possessed sufficient strength to achieve total victory over the other, despite years of destructive warfare. The gradual exhaustion of both sides as the civil war dragged on through the 1,140 seconds without decisive result, combined with the emergence of a new generation, represented by Matilda's son Henry of Anjou, who began to take active role in the conflict during his teenage years, created conditions that would eventually permit negotiated settlement when both Stephen and the leading magnates recognized that continued warfare served no one's interests and threatened the complete collapse of royal authority, public order. The succession of disappointments that Stephen suffered during the late 1,140 seconds and early 1,150 seconds, including his failure to capture key strongholds held by Matilda's supporters, the death of his wife, Queen Matilda, who had provided crucial support and leadership during his captivity and its aftermath, and the growing recognition that his son Eustace lacked the qualities necessary to continue the struggle successfully, weakened the king's position and made him more amenable to compromise regarding the succession. The peace agreement reached at Winchester in November 1153, whereby Stephen would retain the throne for the remainder of his life, but would be succeeded by Henry of Anjou rather than by Stephen's son Eustace, represented a compromise that ended the civil war while establishing the succession of a new dynasty that would bring to the English throne a ruler whose vast continental possessions dwarfed even the combined territories of England, Normandy. The death of Stephen in October 1154 occurring conveniently soon after the peace agreement, and sparing England a potentially awkward period when the aging king retained the crown while his vigorous young successor waited impatiently for his inheritance, brought to the throne Henry II, whose accession marked not simply a change of dynasty, but the creation of what historians would call the Angevin Empire, a collection of territories stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees that would dominate Western European politics for the remainder of the 12th century. Henry II's accession to the English throne in December 1154, at the age of 21, brought to power a ruler whose territorial possessions exceeded those of any previous English king, including not only England and Normandy but also Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, inherited from his father Geoffrey of Anjou, and Aquitaine and Gascony acquired through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose divorce from King Louis VII of France and subsequent marriage to Henry in 1152 had created a diplomatic scandal, while fundamentally altering the balance of power in Western Europe. The administrative challenge of governing such dispersed territories, which stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the Mediterranean, and which encompassed regions with different legal traditions, languages, and political cultures, required innovations that built upon the governmental systems developed by Henry I, while adapting them to the unprecedented scale and complexity of the Angevin domains. The itinerant nature of Henry II's kingship, with the ruler constantly moving between England and his continental territories, as military threats, rebellions, diplomatic negotiations, and administrative requirements demanded his attention, meant that effective governance required the development of institutional structures that could function in the king's absence and that could maintain continuity despite the physical separation of the ruler from particular portions of his domains for extended periods. The restoration of royal authority in England after the disorder of Stephen's reign required systematic efforts to destroy the unlicensed castles that had been built during the anarchy, to reassert royal control over the administration of justice that local magnates had usurped during the Civil War, to recover royal lands and rights that Stephen had alienated to secure support, and to rebuild the financial and administrative machinery that had deteriorated during 2 decades of weak royal government. The destruction of unlicensed castles proceeded through a combination of negotiation with their holders, who were offered compensation for surrendering their fortifications, military operations against those who refused to comply with royal demands, and legal proceedings that established the principle that castle construction required royal license and that unauthorized fortifications could be demolished by royal authority without compensation to their builders. The expansion of royal justice during Henry II's reign represented perhaps his most significant and enduring achievement. Transforming English law through the development of standardized procedures, the expansion of royal jurisdiction to encompass matters previously handled by local or feudal courts, and the creation of legal remedies that attracted litigants to royal courts because they offered more efficient and reliable justice than alternative forums. The development of the common law, though that term would not be used until later centuries, occurred through the standardization of legal procedures across the kingdom, the use of itinerant justices who applied consistent legal principles in different localities, and the accumulation of precedents through the recording of judicial decisions that could guide future cases involving similar issues. The Constitutions of Clarendon, promulgated in 1164, attempted to define the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction by codifying customs that Henry claimed had governed church-state relations during his grandfather's reign. Addressing contentious issues, including the trial of criminous clerks who committed secular crimes, appeals to Rome that might undermine royal authority, and the movement of ecclesiastical personnel who owed feudal obligations to the crown, though these provisions provoked fierce opposition from Archbishop Thomas Becket, who rejected royal claims to jurisdiction over clergy, and who insisted on the independence of ecclesiastical courts from secular interference. The conflict between Henry and Becket that dominated English politics during the 1160s and early 1170s reflected fundamental disagreements about the proper relationship between secular and spiritual authority, with the king insisting that all his subjects, including clergy, owed obedience to royal justice, while the archbishop maintained that clergy accused of crimes should be tried in church courts and that appeals to Rome represented an essential aspect of ecclesiastical liberty that no secular ruler could legitimately restrict. Becket's exile from 1164 to 1170 created an international controversy that drew in the Pope, the King of France, and other European rulers, who saw in the English dispute broader issues regarding the limits of secular authority over the Church. While Henry's attempts to secure his dynasty through the coronation of his eldest son as junior king in 1170, without Becket's participation as Archbishop of Canterbury, intensified the conflict and set the stage for the current tragedy that would follow. The murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on the 29th of December 11 by 4 knights who claimed to be acting on behalf of the king, though Henry's exact role in ordering or encouraging the killing remains historically controversial, transformed a political and jurisdictional dispute into a religious crisis that threatened Henry's position and that required him to perform public penance, including being scourged at Becket's tomb in 1174 to restore his reputation and to prevent papal sanctions that might have encouraged rebellion against his rule. The rapid development of Becket's cult following his martyrdom, with miracles reported at his tomb within days of his death, and with Canterbury becoming one of the major pilgrimage sites in Christendom, demonstrated the power of popular religious sentiment and created a permanent monument to ecclesiastical resistance against secular authority that would influence church-state relations for centuries. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174 tested the stability of Henry's empire when his sons, Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey rebelled against their father's authority with the support of Queen Eleanor, King Louis VII of France, the Count of Flanders, and numerous barons in England and on the continent who saw opportunity in the royal family's divisions, creating the most serious threat to Angevin power during Henry II's reign, and demonstrating the fragility of dynastic loyalty when competing interests and ambitions overrode filial obligations. The suppression of the Great Revolt demonstrated both the resilience of the governmental systems that Henry had established and the personal capability of the king who, despite facing coordinated rebellion across multiple territories simultaneously, managed to maintain control over most of his domains while systematically defeating his enemies through a combination of military force, diplomatic maneuvering, and the exploitation of divisions among the rebel coalition. The capture of King William of Scotland, who had invaded northern England in support of the rebels, the defeat of Flemish forces at the Battle of Fornham in Suffolk, the successful defense of Normandy against French attacks, and the eventual submission of Henry's sons, who recognized that their rebellion had failed, demonstrated that royal resources and loyal supporters outweighed the rebel coalition despite its initially impressive appearance. The penance that Henry performed at Becket's tomb in July 1174, walking barefoot through Canterbury to the cathedral and allowing himself to be scourged by the monks, occurred just days before the capture of the Scottish king, and was interpreted by contemporaries as evidence that divine favour had returned to Henry following his reconciliation with the martyred archbishop's memory. Though modern historians recognise the penance as a calculated political move designed to neutralise ecclesiastical opposition and to demonstrate humility that might win back wavering supporters. The settlement that followed the Great Revolt saw Henry maintain control over all his territories, while his sons received increased revenues and nominal authority over particular regions, though the king retained ultimate power and demonstrated through his continued dominance that the rebellion had not fundamentally weakened his position, despite the embarrassment of being opposed by his own family. The legal reforms implemented during the latter part of Henry's reign built upon earlier innovations, while addressing specific problems that had emerged through practical experience in administering justice across the Angevin domains. With the Assize of Northampton in 1176 expanding the jurisdiction of royal courts while standardizing procedures for criminal prosecution throughout England. The development of possessory assizes, including novel disseisin, mort d'ancestor, and darrein presentment, provided efficient mechanisms for resolving disputes about landholding without requiring the complex and time-consuming determinations of ultimate legal right that had characterized earlier property litigation, creating legal procedures that attracted litigants through their speed and reliability, while expanding royal jurisdiction at the expense of feudal and local courts. The increasing use of juries to determine questions of fact in legal disputes represented a significant innovation that distinguished English legal procedure from continental systems that relied more heavily on written proofs and judicial inquiry, with the jury system developing from its origins in administrative inquiries and criminal accusations into a fundamental feature of English common law that would influence legal development throughout the English-speaking world. The expansion of the writ system during Henry II's reign created standardized procedures for initiating litigation in royal courts, with different writs providing access to particular types of legal remedies, and with the development of new writs enabling royal courts to address evolving legal problems and to extend royal jurisdiction into areas previously outside the purview of royal justice. The professional class of lawyers and judges that emerged during Henry's reign to administer the increasingly complex legal system included men trained through practical experience in royal courts rather than through university education in Roman or canon law, creating a distinctively English legal profession whose expertise derived from mastery of procedural technicalities and accumulated precedents rather than from theoretical jurisprudence. The financial innovations that characterized Henry II's government included more systematic exploitation of feudal incidents, the development of new forms of taxation, including the Saladin tithe, levied in 1188 to finance crusading efforts, and the efficient administration of royal estates and rights that generated revenues sufficient to support the expensive military campaigns and administrative operations required to maintain the Angevin Empire. The increasing use of scutage payments in lieu of personal military service reflected the practical difficulties of maintaining feudal armies for extended campaigns, and the advantages of hiring mercenary forces whose service continued as long as payment was provided, rather than being limited to the 40 days of obligation that characterized traditional feudal service. The military challenges that Henry faced during the later years of his reign included not only the rebellion of his sons, but also the constant need to defend his continental territories against the French king, to suppress rebellions by disaffected barons, and to maintain control over the volatile Welsh marches and the uncertain Scottish border, where royal authority remained contested. The death of Henry the young king in 1183, while in rebellion against his father, eliminated the designated heir and created new succession uncertainties, while the subsequent conflicts among Henry's surviving sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, over their respective inheritances and expectations, demonstrated that the divisions within the royal family had not been resolved by the suppression of the Great Revolt. The final years of Henry II's reign saw increasing pressure from King Philip II Augustus of France, who exploited divisions within the Angevin family by supporting Prince Richard's demands against his father, leading to the humiliating defeat of 1189, when Henry was forced to accept a peace agreement that recognized Richard as his heir, and that required him to give the kiss of peace to many who had rebelled against him. The death of Henry II at Chinon in July 1189, broken in health and spirit after learning that his favourite son John had joined Richard in rebellion against him, ended the reign of one of medieval England's most effective and important kings, whose governmental innovations and territorial expansion had created the foundations for the Angevin Empire, while whose personal failures in managing family relationships had sown the seeds of future conflicts. Part 43. The accession of Richard I to the English throne in 1189 brought to power a king whose interests and priorities centred on military glory, crusading enterprise, and the defence of his continental territories, rather than on the detailed administration of England, which he viewed primarily as a source of revenue to finance his military ambitions and continental commitments. Richard's rapid departure for the Third Crusade, within months of his coronation, following elaborate preparations that included selling offices, rights, and privileges to raise the enormous sums necessary to finance the crusading expedition, left England under the governance of justiciars and other officials, whose authority derived from royal appointment and whose effectiveness depended on the institutional structures that had been developed during Henry II's reign. The absence of the king from England for virtually his entire reign, except for brief periods in 1189 to 1190 and 1194, demonstrated that the governmental systems established by the Norman and Angevin kings had achieved sufficient institutional stability to function effectively, even when the personal presence of the ruler was removed for years at a time, maintaining public order, collecting revenues, and administering justice through bureaucratic procedures and professional administrators. The financial demands imposed by Richard's crusading activities and his subsequent ransom, after being captured while returning from the Holy Land, required unprecedented levels of taxation and revenue collection that strained the fiscal systems developed during Henry II's reign. With the implementation of special levies, the exploitation of feudal incidents to their maximum extent, and the systematic extraction of revenues from every possible source, demonstrating both the administrative capacity of the English government and the burden that royal ambitions could place on the kingdom's resources. The regency arrangements that governed England during Richard's absence created opportunities for conflict between different officials and factions, particularly between William Longchamp, who served as justiciar and papal legate, but whose arrogant behaviour and foreign origin generated resentment, and Prince John, whose position as the king's brother and his extensive landholdings in England gave him both the motive and the means to challenge the arrangements Richard had made for governing in his absence. The conspiracy between John and King Philip, Augustus of France, during Richard's imprisonment in Germany, from 1192 to 1194, when John offered to recognise Philip as overlord of Normandy in exchange for French support in seizing the English throne, demonstrated the continuing vulnerability of the Angevin Empire to internal divisions and external pressure, though John's plot collapsed when Richard's release became imminent, and when most English barons remained loyal to their absent king. The successful collection of the enormous ransom demanded by Emperor Henry VI for Richard's release, amounting to 150,000 marks, or approximately 2 to 3 years of normal royal revenue, demonstrated the wealth that the English economy could generate when subjected to systematic exploitation, and showed that England had become sufficiently prosperous and well administered to support extraordinary financial demands that would have been impossible for earlier medieval kingdoms to meet. Richard's brief return to England in 1194 allowed him to reassert royal authority, to punish those who had supported John's conspiracy and to conduct a second coronation ceremony that symbolically renewed his kingship after the humiliation of imprisonment. Though the king's rapid departure for Normandy to confront Philip Augustus's territorial encroachments demonstrated that England remained secondary to continental concerns in Richard's strategic priorities. The military campaigns that occupied the final years of Richard's reign centered on the defense of Normandy against French aggression, with the construction of Château Gaillard, overlooking the Seine, representing Richard's most impressive architectural and military achievement, a massive fortification that incorporated the latest developments in castle design and that was intended to serve as an impregnable barrier protecting the approaches to Rouen. The death of Richard I in 1199 from gangrene, following a crossbow wound, received while besieging the minor castle of Chalais-Chabrol in the Limousin, allegedly over a dispute about treasure found on the lands of a rebellious vassal. Removed from the political scene, a king whose military reputation and personal courage had earned him legendary status despite his neglect of English affairs and his exploitation of English resources for continental purposes. The succession of John to the English throne and the Angevin continental possessions, despite the arguably superior claim of Arthur of Brittany, who was the son of John's older brother Geoffrey, and who therefore stood closer to Richard in the direct line of descent, according to principles of primogeniture, demonstrated that practical considerations about the capacity to hold power effectively outweighed strict application of hereditary principles when the succession remained contested. John's reign from 1199 to 1216 would prove disastrous for the Angevin Empire through the loss of Normandy and other continental territories to Philip Augustus, the development of conflicts with the papacy that resulted in England being placed under interdict, and the baronial rebellion that forced John to accept Magna Carta in 1215, creating the most serious constitutional crisis of the medieval period and establishing precedents that would influence English political development for centuries. The loss of Normandy to Philip Augustus between 1202 and 1204 represented the most catastrophic territorial defeat suffered by the English crown since the Norman conquest itself, fundamentally altering the relationship between England and the continent, while eliminating the territorial connection that had defined Anglo-Norman identity for nearly a century and a half, since William the Conqueror had united the duchy and kingdom under a single ruler. The military campaigns that led to the loss of Normandy revealed John's weaknesses as a military commander and political leader, with his murder of Arthur of Brittany in 1203 alienating many Norman barons who had previously supported the Angevin cause, his failure to relieve besieged strongholds, allowing Philip to systematically reduce Norman defences, and his retreat to England while Norman territories fell to French conquest, demonstrating a failure of leadership that contrasted sharply with the aggressive defence that his father and brother would have mounted. The fall of Château Gaillard in 1204 after a lengthy siege that demonstrated French mastery of siege warfare techniques and John's inability to organise effective relief efforts symbolised the collapse of Norman resistance and marked the effective end of the territorial connection between England and Normandy that had shaped political and cultural development since 1066. The loss of Normandy forced English barons who held lands on both sides of the Channel to choose between their English and Norman estates, as Philip Augustus demanded that they perform homage to him for their Norman properties, while John insisted on their exclusive loyalty to the English crown, creating a situation where the cross-channel landholding that had characterized the Anglo-Norman aristocracy since the conquest became impossible to maintain. The separation of England from Normandy had profound consequences for English political and cultural development, including the gradual emergence of a distinctively English identity among the baronage, who increasingly saw themselves as English rather than Norman, the reduction of continental cultural influences that had shaped English aristocratic society since 1066, and the concentration of baronial attention on English affairs rather than continental politics. The conflict between John and Pope Innocent III over the election of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury. When John refused to accept the Pope's candidate and instead insisted on his own nominee, led to England being placed under papal interdict from 1208 to 1214, suspending most religious services throughout the kingdom and creating a spiritual crisis that weakened John's position, while demonstrating the power of the papacy to pressure even powerful secular rulers through ecclesiastical sanctions. John's eventual submission to papal authority in 1213, when he accepted England and Ireland as papal fiefs and agreed to pay annual tribute to Rome, represented a dramatic reversal that damaged royal prestige, while providing John with papal support that would prove valuable during the subsequent baronial rebellion. The military disaster at the Battle of Bouvines in July 1214, where Philip Augustus defeated a coalition army that included John's allies, even though the English king himself was campaigning elsewhere, ended any realistic hope of recovering the lost Angevin territories, and exposed the futility of John's continental ambitions, creating domestic political conditions that made the continuation of royal autocracy impossible, as barons who had financed unsuccessful campaigns demanded accountability and reform. The baronial rebellion that began in early 1215 reflected accumulated grievances about John's arbitrary governance, his financial exactions that exceeded traditional limits, his manipulation of the legal system to extort money and punish opponents, and his military failures that had wasted English resources without achieving any compensating gains, creating a coalition of opposition that included not only barons with personal grievances against the king, but also those who sought to establish constitutional principles, limiting royal authority. The negotiations at Runnymede in June 1215 produced Magna Carta, a document that attempted to define the limits of royal authority and to establish principles of governance that would protect baronial rights, while constraining the arbitrary exercise of royal power that had characterized John's reign, and that threatened the stability of the relationship between crown and aristocracy. The provisions of Magna Carta addressed specific abuses, including arbitrary taxation that violated feudal custom, manipulation of the legal system that allowed the king to sell justice or to deny it to his opponents, exploitation of feudal incidents, including reliefs and wardships that exceeded reasonable bounds, and violations of traditional rights, including access to justice and protection of property that undermined the security of landholding throughout the kingdom. The famous clause declaring that no free man should be imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, or harmed except by lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land, established the principle of due process that would become central to English and later American constitutional traditions, though the immediate practical impact of this provision in 1215 remained limited by the restricted definition of free men and by uncertainties about enforcement mechanisms. The security clause that established a committee of 25 barons with authority to constrain the king if he violated the charter's provisions represented an extraordinary limitation on royal authority that John accepted only under duress, and that he immediately sought to repudiate once circumstances permitted, leading to renewed civil war that would continue beyond John's death. The papal annulment of Magna Carta, within months of its acceptance, granted by Innocent III at John's request on grounds that the charter had been extorted through force and that it violated royal prerogatives that the Pope, as John's feudal overlord, had a duty to protect, demonstrated that the constitutional principles established at Runnymede would require ongoing struggle to maintain, and that royal acceptance of limitations on monarchical power would not become permanent without sustained baronial pressure and eventual recognition that cooperation between crown and aristocracy served the interests of both parties. The resumption of civil war following the papal annulment of Magna Carta saw baronial forces invite Prince Louis of France to take the English throne, leading to French intervention that brought foreign troops onto English soil and that created the bizarre situation of barons fighting against their anointed king in alliance with the son of the French king, whose conquest of Normandy had destroyed the Angevin Empire. The death of John in October 1216 during the Civil War eliminated the personal focus of baronial opposition while creating opportunities for reconciliation around the person of his 9-year-old son, Henry III, whose minority government issued a revised version of Magna Carta in 1217 that omitted the most objectionable clauses while maintaining core principles regarding limits on arbitrary royal authority. The transformation of England during the century and a half of Norman and Angevin rule from 1066 to 1216 encompassed fundamental changes in political structures, social organization, legal systems, economic practices, and cultural developments that created the foundations for medieval English civilization and that established patterns that would influence English development for centuries beyond the medieval period. The replacement of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with Norman and later Angevin landholders had created a ruling class whose continental connections and cultural orientations initially made them seem foreign conquerors, but who gradually developed identification with England as successive generations. Born in the kingdom, adopted English alongside French as their languages, and as the loss of Normandy under John forced the aristocracy to choose between their English and continental identities. The ecclesiastical transformation of England under Norman and Angevin rule had reshaped the English church through the introduction of reformed monasticism that emphasized stricter observance and closer connections to Rome, the construction of massive Romanesque and early Gothic cathedrals that physically dominated the landscape and symbolized the power and permanence of Christian civilization, the appointment of learned bishops and abbots who brought continental European intellectual traditions to England, and the integration of England into broader European religious and intellectual movements that connected English churchmen to developments throughout Latin Christendom. The architectural legacy of Norman England included not only the great cathedrals at Durham, Canterbury, Winchester, and elsewhere that demonstrated the engineering sophistication and aesthetic ambitions of Norman builders, but also the hundreds of castles that dotted the English landscape from Cornwall to Northumberland, the thousands of parish churches constructed in stone to replace earlier timber structures, and the monastic complexes that housed communities of monks and canons who maintained the liturgical, educational, and charitable activities that medieval religious houses provided. The legal innovations developed during Norman and Angevin rule created the foundations for English common law through the standardization of procedures, the expansion of royal jurisdiction, the use of juries to determine facts in legal disputes, the accumulation of precedents that guided future decisions, and the development of a professional class of lawyers and judges whose expertise derived from practical experience rather than theoretical training in Roman law. The administrative achievements of Norman and Angevin government included the development of specialized institutions like the Exchequer that employed sophisticated accounting procedures, the creation of professional bureaucracies staffed by educated clerks whose careers depended on loyal service rather than inherited position, the maintenance of systematic records, including Domesday Book, and the pipe rolls that enabled effective financial management, and the dispatch of itinerant justices who extended royal authority throughout the kingdom while maintaining connections between the centre and the localities. Part 48. The economic transformation of England during this period reflected both the disruption caused by conquest and subsequent conflicts, and the eventual development that resulted from integration into continental European commercial networks, the introduction of new agricultural techniques and more systematic estate management, the growth of towns, and the expansion of trade that characterized the commercial revolution of the 12th century, and the gradual recovery of population and prosperity following the devastation of the immediate post-conquest period. The social changes that accompanied Norman and Angevin rule included the gradual emergence of a hybrid Anglo-Norman culture that combined elements from both conquered and conquerors, the development of new forms of aristocratic identity that emphasized chivalric values and courtly behavior, the evolution of relationships between lords and peasants as manorial systems became more rigidly defined, and as serfdom became more clearly distinguished from freedom, and the slow integration of Norman and English populations through intermarriage and shared experiences over multiple generations. The linguistic legacy of the Norman period profoundly shaped the English language through the introduction of thousands of French words into English vocabulary, particularly in domains associated with government, law, the military, the church, and aristocratic culture, while English persisted as the language of the common people and eventually re-emerged during the 13th and 14th centuries as a literary language that bore the permanent imprint of Norman French influence. The cultural achievements of Norman and Angevin England included the development of historical writing that combined Anglo-Saxon chronicle traditions with continental European approaches to narrative history, the patronage of vernacular and Latin literature that produced works ranging from the Arthurian romances that Geoffrey of Monmouth popularized to the theological and philosophical works produced in English monasteries and schools, and the artistic production that created manuscript illuminations, metalwork, ivory carvings, and other objects that demonstrated the sophistication of English craftsmanship. The political legacy of Norman and Angevin rule included the creation of strong royal government that could mobilize resources effectively, maintain public order across a large territory, and project power both domestically and internationally. Though this governmental strength was balanced by the emergence of constitutional principles through Magna Carta that established the concept that royal authority was subject to law and that the king could not govern purely through arbitrary will, without regard for the rights and interests of his subjects. The experience of cross-channel rule during the Norman and Angevin periods created lasting connections between England and the continent that would continue to influence English foreign policy and cultural development even after the loss of Normandy eliminated the territorial basis for these connections. With English kings continuing to hold substantial French territories in Gascony and elsewhere, and with English involvement in continental European politics remaining a constant feature of medieval and early modern English statecraft. Part 49, the comparative assessment of Norman and Angevin rule in England, reveals both the achievements and the limitations of the governmental, social, and cultural systems that developed during this transformative period, demonstrating that while the Norman conquest and its aftermath brought sophisticated administrative practices, impressive architectural monuments, and legal innovations that would shape English development for centuries, these achievements came at enormous cost in terms of the violence of conquest, the suffering inflicted during the suppression of rebellions, particularly through campaigns like the Harrying of the North, the displacement and dispossession of the English aristocracy, and the reduction of many English people to servile status under Norman lords. The question of whether England benefited from Norman rule, or whether the conquest represented a disaster for English civilization, has generated scholarly debate that reflects different values and interpretative frameworks, with some historians emphasizing the long-term benefits of stronger government, more sophisticated legal systems, and fuller integration into European civilization, while others stress the immediate costs in lives and suffering, the destruction of Anglo-Saxon culture and institutions that were sophisticated in their own right, and the imposition of foreign rule that treated English people as a conquered population for generations. The resilience of English culture despite Norman political and military dominance demonstrated that conquest could not entirely eliminate the heritage of the conquered people, as English language persisted among the common people and eventually re-emerged in modified form, as elements of Anglo-Saxon law and administration were incorporated into Norman systems because they proved effective, as English artistic and literary traditions influenced the hybrid culture that developed, and as the descendants of both conquerors and conquered gradually merged into a unified national community that came to identify itself as English rather than Norman or Anglo-Saxon. The institutional innovations developed during Norman and Angevin rule provided England with governmental capabilities that exceeded those of most contemporary European kingdoms, creating administrative and legal systems that enabled effective central authority while maintaining local institutions that connected royal government to communities throughout the realm, generating revenues sufficient to support ambitious royal policies, while avoiding the complete fiscal exhaustion that excessive taxation might have caused, and maintaining public order effectively enough to enable economic development and population growth, despite periods of civil war and baronial rebellion. The legacy of this formative period extended far beyond the medieval era to influence the development of English constitutional traditions that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world, including the principle that government should operate under law rather than through arbitrary authority, the concept that subjects possess rights that rulers must respect, the tradition of institutional government that functions through established procedures rather than purely through personal royal authority, and the practice of consultation between rulers and leading subjects regarding major policy decisions, particularly those involving taxation and military service. The story of the Normans in England, from their origins as Viking raiders, who settled in northern France to their conquest and transformation of England, represents one of the most dramatic and consequential episodes in European history, demonstrating how a relatively small group of warriors and administrators could fundamentally reshape the political, social, legal, and cultural landscape of a kingdom through military prowess, administrative skill, architectural ambition, and the ruthless determination to impose their authority on a conquered population. The evolution of Norman identity from Scandinavian raiders to Christian dukes to English kings occurred over barely a century and a half. Yet the speed of this transformation did not prevent the Normans from creating lasting institutions and establishing cultural patterns that would shape English development for centuries after the Norman conquest itself had receded into historical memory. The synthesis of Norman and English elements that gradually emerged during the 12th century created a distinctive Anglo-Norman civilization that combined the military and administrative traditions of the conquerors with elements of English law, language, and culture that proved too deeply rooted to be entirely eliminated, producing a hybrid society that would eventually develop into a unified English nation whose character bore the permanent imprint of the Norman conquest. The governmental systems, legal traditions, architectural monuments, and cultural achievements that developed during the Norman and Angevin periods provided England with institutional foundations that enabled the kingdom to emerge as one of medieval Europe's most effectively governed and prosperous realms, capable of mobilizing substantial resources for military campaigns, maintaining internal order through sophisticated administrative and judicial systems, and supporting cultural and intellectual developments that contributed to the broader flowering of medieval European civilization. The ultimate judgment on Norman rule in England must recognize both the tremendous costs in violence, displacement, and suffering that the conquest entailed, particularly for the English population who experienced military devastation, social subordination, and the loss of their traditional rulers and institutions, and the long-term developments in government, law, and culture that emerged from the fusion of Norman and English traditions, and that would influence not only medieval England, but also the development of constitutional government and legal systems throughout the English-speaking world in subsequent centuries, creating legacies that extended far beyond the medieval period to shape the modern world in ways that the Norman conquerors themselves could never have anticipated or imagined, demonstrating that historical transformations often produce consequences that transcend the immediate intentions of those who initiate them, and that the complex interplay of conquest and resistance, innovation and tradition, foreign influence and indigenous resilience can produce outcomes that reflect neither the complete triumph of conquerors nor the simple preservation of existing patterns, but rather the emergence of new synthetic forms that draw upon multiple traditions while creating something genuinely novel.